Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The autumn of 2023 was painting Shepherdsville, Kentucky in brilliant shades of amber and gold. It was a picturesque backdrop for a life that, from the outside, seemed to be slowly piecing itself back together. In a modest house on Bentwood Drive lived Tiffany Lucas, a 32-year-old mother, alongside her two sons, 9-year-old Jaden Howard and 6-year-old Maurice Baker Jr. To the world of social media, Tiffany appeared to be the picture of devotion. Her Facebook profile told a story through smiling faces, a testament to love that seemed to know no bounds. Just 1 week before the world would come to know their names for the most heartbreaking of reasons, a Halloween photo captured all three in costume. "Happy and full of life," Tiffany had written. "Happy Halloween from us to you. May the force be with you." Back in May, another photo of her with the boys carried the caption, "My lifeline, my heartbeat, my everything." These were the carefully chosen images she shared with the world, a curated glimpse of maternal love and joy. But behind that digital curtain, a very different story was taking shape, one filled with chaos, fear, and a mind slowly approaching the edge of something dark and dangerous. The house on Bentwood Drive wasn't the happy home portrayed in those online posts. It was a rental property falling into disarray, with eviction notices stacking up like autumn leaves, a physical reflection of the turmoil consuming Tiffany's life. She was a woman haunted by the shadows of drug addiction, a battle she'd fought and seemingly won multiple times, only to find herself trapped once again. There had been a drug arrest back in 2018. She'd pleaded guilty and served 30 days behind bars. After that, she'd managed to stay out of trouble, at least officially. Tiffany had once dreamed of something different. In 2016, she'd opened a small business called Tiff's One-Stop Shop, a convenience store where she cooked and sold hot food. She'd even been interviewed by the local news station, her eyes bright with hope for this new chapter. But the business had failed, closing its doors not long after opening. Another dream that slipped through her fingers. Now, in the fall of 2023, Tiffany was fighting to get clean again. She'd landed a job at a law firm, earning decent money, and with it came a renewed sense of hope, a chance for a fresh start with her boys. She made the decision to wean herself off opioids, the drugs that had held her captive for so many years. She'd done it before when she was pregnant with Jaden, and again with Maurice. Both times she'd quit cold turkey, and both boys had been born healthy, free from the grip of her addiction. In 2018, she'd lost custody of her children, but she'd worked the program, gotten clean, and brought them home. This time, she was determined to make it stick for good. She was exhausted from hiding her addiction from her children, from taking just enough to keep the sickness at bay. So she began reducing her dosage, little by little, until about 10 days before the tragedy struck. She stopped completely. But this time, something was terrifyingly different. As the drugs left her system, a darkness began creeping into her mind. A psychosis that would twist her reality into a landscape of delusion and bone-deep paranoia. It started quietly, a flicker of fear here, a paranoid thought there. Then it grew, consuming her until she was no longer the woman her family and friends recognized. She became convinced that she and her sons were being hunted by a powerful, shadowy conspiracy. This group, she believed, was stalking them with plans to harm them in unspeakable ways. Her behavior grew more erratic by the day. On November 5th, she visited her aunt and grandmother, her mind already caught in the grip of delusion. She told them she'd been followed by police on the drive over. She claimed she'd had to throw her cell phone and her children's video game console out the car window because they were being monitored, tracked by the unseen forces closing in on them. During the visit, she pointed to a tree, insisting she could see scripture written in its bark. When her family couldn't see what she saw, frustration consumed her. Later, on the drive home, she spotted angels and scripture in the sky. She took over 40 photos of what appeared to be blank sky, sending them to her family. A desperate attempt to make them see what seemed so real to her. The next day, her grandmother received a chilling text from an unknown number. "It's Tiff. Call 911. Tiffany had rushed into a Family Dollar, telling the clerk that someone was chasing her, that she feared for her life, and that she desperately needed to use the phone. She reached out to her neighbor, begging her to pray with her, her soul crying out for help from a place of deep, terrifying confusion. The day before the tragedy unfolded, Tiffany was at a Waffle House with her sons. A security video from the restaurant shows her suddenly jumping up from the counter and wrapping her arms protectively around Maurice. She later told forensic psychiatrist Dr. Philip Arnick that she'd heard a stranger in the Waffle House say her son's full name out loud. In her fractured reality, this was confirmation of her deepest fears. The stranger had to be part of the conspiracy. They knew her son's name. They were getting closer. Her family and friends could see that something was deeply wrong. They knew she was struggling, but none of them could have imagined the nightmare that was about to unfold. "I knew something wasn't right," they would say again and again in the days that followed. "But I never thought she would hurt those kids." The morning of November 8th, 2023, arrived heavy with dread in the small house on Bentwood Drive. Tiffany's mind had become a whirlwind of fear and paranoia. An amber alert lit up her phone screen. To anyone else, it would have been just another routine notification. But to Tiffany, it felt like a message meant specifically for her. The day before at the Waffle House, the waitress who'd taken her order wore a name tag that read Amber. In Tiffany's fractured state of mind, this couldn't possibly be a coincidence. The Amber Alert was about her and her children. The faceless enemies she'd been running from were finally closing in. She spotted a police van in the neighborhood, another sign that the conspiracy was tightening its grip. She kept Jaden and Maurice home from school that day, a desperate attempt to keep them safe, to keep them close. The house that had once been their home had transformed into a fortress, with Tiffany as its terrified guardian. Then came the sound of sirens in the distance. In her broken mind, those sirens weren't heading to some distant emergency. They were coming for her, coming to her door. Time was running out. A neighbor's Ring doorbell camera would later capture the sounds that shattered the morning's quiet, gunshots fired within 30 seconds of each other. In the bedroom, Tiffany Lucas, the mother who had once called her sons her lifeline, her heartbeat, her everything, took both of her children's lives. She would later tell doctors that she did it to ensure they passed as quickly and painlessly as possible. A twisted act of what she believed was mercy, to spare them from the terrible fate she was convinced awaited them. After the unthinkable act, she turned the gun on herself, but the weapon jammed. Her hands would later show the desperate marks of her attempts to clear the malfunction, to follow her children into that final silence. She was so lost in her delusion that she couldn't understand why the gun wouldn't work. She even told police she had taken her own life, unable to tell the difference between her intention and the reality of the jammed weapon. When she realized she was still alive, her shattered mind couldn't form a new plan. She did the only thing that came to her. She stumbled out of the house, away from the room where her children lay, and into the cool morning air. A neighbor pulling into his driveway saw her walking down the steps of her porch. "My kids are dying," she told him before collapsing in his driveway. The neighbor rushed into the house, discovered the horrific scene, and called 911. When Bullitt County Sheriff's Detective Richard Beal arrived at 2113 Bentwood Drive, he found chaos and despair. One of the boys was already in an ambulance. The other was in the living room, where EMS and fire personnel were fighting desperately to save him. Both Jaden and Maurice had suffered critical injuries. They were still alive when they were rushed to Norton Children's Hospital in Louisville, but their wounds were too severe. They passed away at the hospital, their young lives cut short in an act of violence that no one could comprehend. Tiffany Lucas was found in her neighbor's driveway when police arrived. She was taken into custody and questioned. Her initial statements were a confusing tangle of denial, remorse, and strange explanations. She claimed the shooting was an accident. She said someone had given her the gun. She was in such a bad spot, she told the detective, and was so stupid. She insisted she would never do something like this unless someone had manipulated her. She claimed she'd been controlled through Facebook, through the internet, or through Wi-Fi into doing what she did. A gun was discovered on the bed in the room where the boys were found. A gunshot residue test performed on Tiffany came back positive. Particles consistent with gunshot residue from a discharged firearm were found on her hands. There was no question that she was the one who had pulled the trigger. Tiffany Lucas was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. A Bullitt County judge set her bond at $2 million, declaring her a danger to others. The news of the boys' deaths sent shockwaves through the community. Family members were heartbroken and bewildered. They had witnessed Tiffany's struggles, and some had even tried to step in, calling Child Protective Services with their concerns over the years. But their pleas for help had seemingly gone unheard. Now their worst fears had come true in the most devastating way possible. Vigils were held for Jaden and Maurice. Their small, smiling faces became a symbol of the community's shared grief. The legal battle that followed became a search for answers, for some explanation of an act that seemed to defy all understanding. Tiffany initially pleaded not guilty to the murder charges. Her defense team began building a case around her mental state, preparing to argue that she wasn't criminally responsible for her actions due to insanity. They brought in the expertise of Dr. Philip. Resnick stands as a renowned forensic psychiatrist and leading expert on filicide, the tragic act of a parent taking their own child's life. Just 8 days after the shooting, while Tiffany remained trapped in the grip of her psychotic episode, Dr. Resnick conducted his evaluation. He spoke with her family members and carefully reviewed the extensive police investigation materials. What Dr. Resnick discovered painted a haunting picture of a mind in complete freefall. His findings revealed that Tiffany had been living under the weight of 2 powerful, overlapping delusions in the days before the shooting. The first was a delusion of grandeur. She believed God was speaking directly to her, that she had been chosen for some higher purpose. The second was a persecutory delusion, a bone-deep conviction that she and her sons were being hunted by a dangerous group, intent on causing them unimaginable harm. Dr. Resnick explained something crucial. When someone exists in such a severe psychotic state, they cannot tell the difference between these delusions and reality. The things she believed felt as real to her as the ground beneath her feet. The defense team argued that Tiffany's psychosis stemmed from a rare side effect of opioid withdrawal. While opioids don't typically trigger psychosis, the defense brought in neuropharmacologist Dr. Jonathan Littman, who explained that in extraordinary cases, opioid withdrawal can awaken dormant psychological vulnerabilities, leading to devastating mental health crises. In a cruel twist of fate, Tiffany's attempt to get clean, to build a better life for her children, had pushed her into the very psychotic episode that would end their lives. But the boys' family rejected the insanity defense completely. To them, Tiffany wasn't a victim of mental illness. She was something far worse. Someone who had committed an unforgivable act. It wasn't an accident, said Maurice's aunt, Bobby Baker, her voice trembling with grief and rage. One of the boys was shot twice. You don't shoot 2 little boys and call it an accident. They saw her claims of manipulation and mental illness as nothing more than a selfish attempt to escape responsibility for her actions. Then came a shocking turn of events. On October 23rd, 2024, Nearly a year after the killings, Tiffany Lucas walked into that Bullitt County courtroom and changed her plea. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. By doing so, she gave up her right to a trial and to any appeal. The question of her guilt was settled. Only one thing remained: her punishment. The sentencing hearing on November 22, 2024, became a day of reckoning. The courtroom filled with the raw grief and anger of Jaden and Maurice's families. For the first time since Tiffany's arrest, they could finally confront her. Finally give voice to their pain. One by one, they took the stand. Their victim impact statements formed a heartbreaking chorus of loss and rage. Regina Rowland, Jaden's grandmother, looked directly at Tiffany with tears in her voice. "You have ripped our lives apart. You could have given those kids to us, and we would have taken care of them. But you were selfish." Bobby Baker, Maurice's aunt, delivered words sharp with a pain that would never heal. "I will never forgive you. I hope every day you close your eyes that they haunt you, but you don't deserve to see them." She made a solemn vow to attend every parole hearing, ensuring Tiffany would never taste freedom again. The prosecution argued that Tiffany Lucas hadn't just murdered Jaden and Maurice. She had forever shattered the lives of everyone who loved them. They called it a horrible crime where 2 completely innocent kids had their lives snuffed out in a matter of seconds. Tiffany's defense attorneys made their case for mercy, maintaining that she had been lost in a psychotic episode triggered by opioid withdrawal when she killed her sons. Her attorney, Richard Lechak, told the court, Tiffany's psychotic episode was brought on by drug withdrawal. She stopped using and in trying to get clean. This was the devastating side effect. They showed the court video evidence of her erratic behavior in the days leading up to the shooting, a desperate attempt to reveal the depths of her mental crisis. They argued that Tiffany had loved her children deeply, and that the woman who killed them wasn't the real Tiffany, but someone lost in a storm of psychosis. They asked for a sentence of 35 years, a sentence that would offer at least a glimmer of hope for some distant future. But in the end, the weight of the crime proved too heavy, the loss too profound. Judge Rodney Burris listened to all the testimony and arguments before delivering his decision. For the murder of her 2 sons, Tiffany Lucas received 2 life sentences in prison. She will become eligible for parole in 20 years, though as the prosecutor noted, it's highly unlikely the parole board would ever grant it. The sentence brought the families a small measure of closure, a sense that justice, in some form, had finally been served. But it could never bring back the 2 little boys whose lives ended far too soon. The story of Tiffany Lucas carries with it an overwhelming weight of tragedy. It's the heartbreaking tale of a mother's love consumed by the shadows of mental illness and addiction. And at its center are 2 young souls who will live on forever in the hearts of everyone who cherished them. Today, the quiet that blankets Bentwood Drive serves as a haunting reminder. It whispers of that terrible day when a mother's unthinkable actions tore through a family and shook an entire community to its core. What remains is a painful legacy of grief and questions that may never find their answers. Story 2. In the quiet, manicured cul-de-sacs of Grovetown, Georgia, friendship blossomed under the warm suburban sun. Kay Parsons and Rebecca "Becky" Sears shared a bond that seemed as picture-perfect as the neighborhood around them. They weren't just next-door neighbors. They were, by every outward appearance, the closest of friends. Their lives reflected the comfortable rhythm of middle-class contentment. Both were devoted mothers whose sons played on the same baseball team. They worked side by side at a local physical therapy clinic, their days flowing with the familiar patterns of carpools, work schedules, and weekend gatherings. Kay, a 41-year-old who'd moved down from Pennsylvania, was beloved for her warmth and unwavering devotion to her husband, David, and their young son. Becky, energetic and naturally outgoing, served as the social center of their small circle. Their friendship felt like a constant, a comforting anchor in the predictable landscape of their suburban lives. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect friendship, something toxic was growing. A hidden affair that would eventually tear their world apart and lead to an act of shocking, brutal violence. Becky Sears wasn't the friend she appeared to be. She was a woman consumed by desperate, obsessive love for Kay's husband, David. And in the spring of 2009, that obsession would twist into something far darker. A carefully planned plot to eliminate a romantic rival. This is the story of how suburban friendship became a deadly love triangle. A tale that would expose the dangerous undercurrents of deceit and betrayal lurking behind the most ordinary facades, building toward a crime so devastating it would leave a permanent scar on their quiet community. The morning of March 25, 2009, started like countless others in the Parsons household. Kay drove her son to school, one of those routine acts of maternal love that mark the beginning of each day. They stopped for a quick breakfast, an ordinary moment that would tragically be her last. As Kay returned home that morning, pulling into the garage of her house on Hot Springs Drive, she had no idea she was walking straight into a trap. The sanctuary of her own home had been transformed into something sinister, and she was about to become the target. Waiting for her in the quiet shadows of her house was an ambush. As she stepped from the garage into the foyer, the attack erupted without warning. It was an explosion of savage, uncontrolled violence. The weapon was a claw hammer, an ordinary household tool turned into something deadly. The first strike came swift and unexpected. Kay fought back with everything she had, a desperate struggle for survival. Blood evidence would later reveal that she fled from her attacker, stumbling through her own home, trying desperately to escape the relentless assault. The chase ended back in the garage, the very place where she'd entered just moments before, believing she was safe. It was there that her killer, consumed by boundless rage, grabbed a second weapon, a baseball bat. The final moments were a frenzy of violence that left Kay Parsons beaten and bloodied on the concrete floor of her own garage. At 8:45 a.m., a handyman arrived for some scheduled work. He knocked on the front door, but silence greeted him. Something felt wrong. Following his instincts, he walked around to the garage and made a horrifying discovery. Kay Parsons lay in a pool of blood, barely breathing, clinging to life by the thinnest thread. He immediately dialed 911. While paramedics raced to the scene, working frantically to save a life that was already slipping away, investigators from the Columbia County Sheriff's Office began piecing together the first clues. The back door had been violently smashed in, broken glass scattered everywhere, clear signs of forced entry. But something felt off. This didn't look like a typical burglary. The level of violence was too extreme, too personal. Then came a strange and puzzling discovery. The house next door, the home of Kay's best friend, Becky Sears, had also been burglarized. This second break-in, happening so close to such a violent crime, struck investigators as deeply unusual. Most criminals would flee after such a brutal attack, not stick around to commit another crime just steps away. As detectives canvassed the neighborhood, their attention turned to Becky Sears' 20-year-old son, Michael. He had a criminal past, a prior conviction for burglary. A neighbor reported seeing him sitting on a boulder across the street from both houses around the time of the attack. Then came the first piece of solid evidence. An investigator spotted a shard of glass embedded in the sole of Michael's shoe. It was a perfect match to the glass from the Parsons' shattered back door. Michael denied everything, but the evidence was compelling. He was taken into custody as the prime suspect in what was about to become a murder case. At the hospital, doctors fought desperately to save Kay Parsons, but her injuries were simply too severe. She was declared brain dead. After an agonizing consultation with the medical team, David Parsons, who had rushed home from an out-of-town trip, faced the heartbreaking decision to remove his wife from life support. The next morning brought devastating news. Kay Parsons had died. What started as a burglary investigation had now become a homicide case, and every piece of evidence seemed to point straight at one person, a troubled young man with a criminal past. But this case was about to spiral into something far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. What appeared to be a simple burglary gone tragically wrong would soon reveal a conspiracy so twisted and sinister that it would shake the entire community to its core. With Kay Parsons now gone, and Michael Sears squarely in investigators' sights, the people of Grovetown waited anxiously. Everything seemed straightforward, if heartbreaking. But Becky Sears, the devoted best friend still reeling from grief, was about to turn this story on its head in the most terrifying way possible. 2 days after the murder on March 27th, something unthinkable happened. Becky made a desperate 911 call from her job at the Healing Hands Physical Therapy Center. Her voice was frantic, filled with terror. She'd been shot. Through panicked breaths, she told the dispatcher how a man had suddenly appeared from the woods behind the clinic. He demanded money, then without warning, fired a bullet into her leg before disappearing back into the trees. But it was what he said as he fled that sent chills down everyone's spine. Next time, I'll aim for the head. The news hit Grovetown like a thunderbolt. Fear rippled through the streets as residents grappled with a terrifying possibility. Was there a dangerous predator stalking their community? Someone who had already taken K.A. Parsons' life and was now hunting down her closest friend. The two attacks seemed unmistakably connected, like pieces of the same horrifying puzzle. Becky Sears, the caring neighbor who had rushed to Kay's bedside at the hospital, had now become a victim herself. Her emotional television interviews, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded for help, painted her as a woman trapped in an unimaginable nightmare. But behind the scenes, investigators were starting to feel uneasy. Something about the shooting didn't sit right. It felt almost too perfectly orchestrated, like a scene from a movie rather than a real crime. Just as their doubts about Becky began to crystallize, a bombshell exploded right in the middle of their investigation. The revelation came from the most unexpected place imaginable, the local jail. Jerry Jacobs, Becky's own brother, was serving time on completely unrelated charges when he saw the news coverage. What he witnessed on those reports compelled him to reach out to police. He had a story to tell, and it would shatter everything they thought they knew about this case. Sitting across from detectives in that sterile interview room, Jerry began dropping revelation after stunning revelation. The friendship between Becky and Kay that everyone had admired, it was all a lie. These two women weren't friends at all. They were bitter rivals, locked in a secret battle over the same man. Kay's husband, David Parsons. Jerry's words painted a completely different picture. His sister Becky had been carrying on a passionate hidden affair with David. She was head over heels in love with him, and that love had twisted into something dark and poisonous. Her resentment toward Kay had grown into something far more dangerous. According to Jerry, Becky had even confided her darkest thoughts to her son Michael, telling him she wished she knew someone who would take care of Kay permanently. This revelation hit the investigation like an earthquake. Suddenly, everything shifted. The random burglary theory crumbled, replaced by something much more personal and sinister. Becky Sears was no longer the heartbroken friend and innocent victim. She was a woman consumed by jealousy with every reason to want her neighbor dead. Jerry's testimony also cast serious doubt on Michael's involvement. If any of Becky's sons had played a role in this nightmare, Jerry insisted, it would have been Christopher Bowers, her younger son. At 19 years old, Christopher was utterly devoted to his mother, willing to do anything for her. Armed with this game-changing information, investigators turned their focus entirely on Becky. They dissected every statement she'd made, every action she'd taken, every detail of her supposed alibi. And slowly, methodically, her carefully constructed story began to fall apart. The pieces started clicking into place with chilling clarity. Christopher Bowers worked part-time at the same physical therapy clinic as his mother, Dee Gas. On the morning of Kay's murder, Becky had offered to give Christopher a ride to work. But instead of dropping him at the clinic as usual, she'd let him out on a street near the Parsons home. She'd then driven her other children to school, creating what seemed like an airtight alibi for herself. After the school run, she'd picked Christopher up from a different street corner. When he got in the car, everything had changed. He'd switched into different clothes. There was blood on his face. And according to the confession Becky would eventually give to police, her son had looked at her and said those bone-chilling words. "I took care of everything." The full, horrifying truth was finally coming into focus. This wasn't a random crime at all. It was cold-blooded, premeditated murder, orchestrated by a woman blinded by jealousy and carried out by her own flesh and blood. Becky Sears was the puppet master, and Christopher Bowers was her devoted instrument of death. She had manipulated her own son, twisting his love and loyalty into something monstrous, turning him into a killer. The break-in at her own house was nothing more than a clumsy attempt at misdirection, designed to make it look like both homes had been targeted by the same random criminal. And that shooting at her workplace? Pure theater. A calculated performance meant to cast herself as another victim and throw investigators off her trail once and for all. It was a web of deception so bold, so intricately woven, that it had nearly succeeded. But one man's conscience, one brother's decision to speak the truth, had torn a gaping hole in her lies. And through that hole, the entire monstrous truth came pouring out. What had started as what seemed like a tragic but straightforward burglary turned murder had revealed itself to be something far more sinister. A maze of lies, betrayal, and conspiracy so dark it defied belief. On March 27, 2009, the very same day Becky Sears staged her own shooting, she and her son, Christopher Bowers, were arrested and charged with the murder of Kay Parsons. The community was stunned. The woman they had watched on television, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded for her friend's safe return, now stood accused of orchestrating her brutal murder. The legal proceedings that followed peeled back the layers of deception, revealing the full, disturbing details of the plot. Prosecutors, led by District Attorney Ashley Wright, methodically unraveled Becky's web of lies, presenting the jury with an overwhelming mountain of evidence. There was the devastating testimony of her brother, Jerry Jacobs, and her other son, Michael. Both confirmed the affair with David Parsons and Becky's chilling desire to see Kay dead. There was the timeline of that fateful morning, the damning evidence of Becky dropping off and picking up her son from the crime scene. And perhaps most shocking of all, there was Becky's own confession. A cold, calculated account of a mother who had calmly helped dispose of her son's bloody clothes after he had just taken a life. The motive was crystal clear. Becky Sears wanted Kay Parsons out of the way so she could have David all to herself. She was a woman so consumed by obsession that she was willing to kill for it. And she was a mother so manipulative that she turned her own child into an instrument of murder. She was, as prosecutors painted her, the mastermind behind the entire horrific scheme. Christopher Bowers, the 19-year-old who had wielded the hammer and bat, was portrayed as nothing more than a pawn in his mother's deadly game. Here was a young man so completely under his mother's influence that he committed an act of unthinkable violence just to please her. His loyalty, a quality that should have been his strength, had been twisted into a weapon of destruction. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the looming threat of the death penalty, Becky Sears and Christopher Bowers ultimately chose to avoid trial. In May of 2012, 3 years after the murder, they both entered guilty pleas in a courtroom packed with Kay's grieving friends and family. Superior Court Judge Cheryl B. Jolly handed down their sentences for their roles in one of the most disturbing murders the region had ever witnessed. Both mother and son received life in prison without the possibility of parole. They also received consecutive life sentences for armed robbery and an additional 20 years for burglary. District Attorney Ashley Wright, speaking after the hearing, didn't mince words about the brutal nature of the crime. "It is quite frankly one of the most disturbing murders I have ever seen," she said. "The plea deals," she explained, spared the Parsons family the additional trauma of a long and painful trial. The story of Kay Parsons' murder stands as a chilling cautionary tale about the destructive power of obsession and the dark secrets that can fester behind the closed doors of suburbia. It's a story of friendship built on lies, love twisted into betrayal, and a maternal bond corrupted into a murderous pact. Kay Parsons, a woman beloved for her kindness and devotion to her family, had the terrible misfortune of living next door to someone who coveted her life. In the end, that neighbor took everything from her, leaving behind a trail of devastation, and a community forever changed by the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who wear the most convincing masks. Story 3. The light in Lancaster, California carries a harsh, clarifying quality. It spills across the flat expanse of the Antelope Valley, baking suburban tracks and strip malls beneath a vast, indifferent sky. For Sheila Cabrera, this was the light of the American dream, a dream she had chased all the way from her native Peru. She and her husband, Josimar, had come to this sun-scorched corner of Los Angeles County seeking something better, a future for their 3 young sons that stretched wider and brighter than anything they'd left behind. From the outside, it seemed they'd found it. They had a home in an apartment complex on Lancaster Boulevard, a place where their children's laughter should have filled every corner. Sheila, at 33, was a woman of quiet strength and deep devotion to her boys. Joser, 36, worked hard to provide for his family. By all appearances, they were just another immigrant family building their lives on hope and determination. But behind the closed door of their apartment, that California light couldn't penetrate the darkness that had taken root. The dream had soured. It curdled into a nightmare of control and fear. The love that once brought them together across continents had become a cage, and Joser was its keeper. Friends and family knew the truth. They saw the bruises that makeup couldn't always hide. They heard the tremor in Sheila's voice whenever she spoke of her husband. Helga Rosito, Sheila's mother, felt her daughter's fear through phone calls, stretching thousands of miles to Peru. Sheila confessed that Josimar's love had become a punishing force. His hands brought only pain. His words carved away at her soul, piece by piece. He wasn't just a husband. He was a tyrant who hurt not only her, but their youngest son too. A 3-year-old boy too small to understand the rage directed at him. For years, Sheila endured it all. She stayed for her children, those 3 bright points of light in her darkening world. She clung to hope that things might change, that the man she'd once loved would emerge from behind the monster he'd become. But by the summer of 2025, that hope had withered. The abuse had become unbearable. Fear for her children's safety pressed down like a suffocating weight. She realized that staying was no longer sacrifice. It was a risk she couldn't afford to take. On August 9th, a Friday, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. She called her mother. Her voice carried a mixture of resolve and fear as she told Helga she was done. The dream was over. She was leaving Josimar, but she wasn't just going to run. She was going to fight back. She planned to file a criminal report, to finally give voice to the secret suffering she'd endured for so long. She would take her children and build a new life, free from the shadow of his anger. It was a declaration of independence, a desperate bid for freedom. But in the twisted logic of an abuser, a wife's departure isn't an ending. It's the ultimate act of defiance. For a man like Josimar Cabrera, who demanded absolute control, Sheila's decision wasn't a plea for peace. It was a declaration of war. He had built his world on the foundation of her fear, and she had just threatened to tear it all down. As Sheila hung up the phone, a fragile sense of hope blooming in her chest, she had no way of knowing she had just signed her own death warrant. The final argument was coming, and it would be the last one she'd ever have. The following day, August 10th, the simmering tension in that apartment on Lancaster Boulevard finally boiled over. The exact words spoken between Sheila and Josimar are lost to the silence of death. But the catalyst was clear. Sheila, summoning courage she didn't know she possessed, told her husband she was leaving him. She asked for a divorce. For Joser, those words were like a lit match to a fuse. They confirmed his greatest fear. He was losing control. The woman he viewed as his possession was threatening to walk away, to take his children, to expose him to the world for what he truly was. In that moment, according to friends who had long feared this day, he snapped. The rage that had been a constant hum in their lives erupted into a storm of violence. The argument escalated, their apartment becoming an arena for one final, brutal struggle. Josimar, his authority challenged and his world crumbling, allegedly reached for a knife. What happened next remains a horrific reality known only to the killer and the cold evidence left behind. Prosecutors would later allege that he used that knife as a deadly weapon in a frenzy of rage. The wounds told a story of a savage personal attack that went far beyond a single blow. It was an act of ultimate possession. If he couldn't have her, then no one would. He had silenced her voice forever, extinguished her defiance, and in the blood-soaked quiet of their apartment, he had reasserted his control in the most absolute and horrifying way imaginable. Sheila Cabrera, the mother, the daughter, the woman who had dreamed of a better life, now lay lifeless on the floor of her own home. Her 3 young sons, the very reason she had fought so hard to live, were now motherless. Their lives forever shattered by the violence that had just unfolded in the next room. The dream wasn't just over, it had been destroyed. And for Josimar Cabrera, the next task was to bury it completely. In the dead of night, as the city of Lancaster slept peacefully, a shadow moved through the quiet corridors of the apartment complex on Lancaster Boulevard. It was 4 a.m. on August 10th. The world lay still and dark, a perfect canvas for hiding a monstrous secret. A neighbor's doorbell camera, that small, unblinking eye, captured the scene with chilling, dispassionate clarity. The footage shows a man identified by authorities as Josimar Cabrera engaged in a grim and exhausting task. He's seen struggling with a large, bulky object, a formless shape wrapped in what appears to be a blanket or drapes. It's the body of his wife, Sheila. He heaves the lifeless weight, his movements a grotesque parody of someone moving furniture. The burden is heavy, awkward. He strains, his muscles fighting against the inert mass, a physical manifestation of the moral weight of his crime. He drags her from the apartment in a slow, horrifying procession through the sleeping complex. Every sound becomes magnified in the pre-dawn silence. The scuff of his shoes on concrete, the soft, terrible friction of the bundle being pulled across the ground. He's a man possessed by a single, desperate purpose: to erase his crime, to make both the evidence and the woman he has just killed disappear forever. There's a cold, calculated deliberation to his actions. This isn't the panicked flight of someone who's lost control. This is the careful, methodical work of a killer trying to cover his tracks. He loads the body into a vehicle, the final terrible act of removing her from the life they had shared. He becomes a ghost in the night, performing a dark ritual under the watchful eye of a silent camera, a digital witness that would soon become his accuser. With Sheila's body hidden away, Josimar began weaving a web of lies, a fragile shield against the inevitable questions. For 2 days, he went about his life as if nothing had happened. A father caring for his 3 sons, a husband whose wife had simply vanished, But the silence from Sheila's phone screamed alarm to those who loved her. Her friends, a tight-knit group who knew the dark truth of her marriage, felt a knowing dread creeping in. Sheila was a constant presence in their lives, a creature of habit and communication. Her sudden absence wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. By August 12th, that dread had transformed into full panic. They knew something was terribly wrong. They went straight to the Lancaster station of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and filed a missing person report. But they didn't stop there. They weren't content to wait for the slow gears of bureaucracy to turn. They knew Josimar, and they suspected the worst. So they took matters into their own hands, becoming detectives in the tragic mystery of their friend's disappearance. They began canvassing the apartment complex, talking to neighbors, asking questions, searching for any clue that might explain where Sheila had gone. One neighbor, Mario Sanchez, recalled an encounter with Josimar. He seemed angry, Mario said, a small but telling detail. The friends, driven by desperate need for answers, fought to check the surveillance systems throughout the complex. And that's when they found it, the doorbell camera video from 4 a.m. On August 10th, they watched the grainy black and white footage, their horror mounting with each passing second. The image of Josimar dragging that large, shrouded object was unmistakable, undeniable. In that moment, their worst fears were confirmed. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was something far worse. They took the video directly to the sheriff's investigators. A single, devastating piece of evidence that blew the case wide open. While Sheila's friends were uncovering the truth, Josimar was spinning a particularly cruel and calculated lie to her family back in Peru. Helga Rosito, frantic with worry, had been trying to reach her daughter for days. When she finally got through to Josimar, he answered with a story designed to exploit her worst fears as an immigrant. He told her that Sheila had been taken by us immigration authorities. It was a lie of chilling ingenuity, a story that would buy him precious time and send Sheila's family down a rabbit hole of bureaucratic confusion. For a mother living a world away, the thought of her daughter being lost in the labyrinthine American immigration system was both terrifying and heartbreakingly plausible. Josimar knew this. He was using her love and her fear as weapons. A final, sadistic twist of the knife. But his time was running out. The discovery of that video had set the police directly on his trail. Foul play was now suspected, and Joser Cabrera had become their prime suspect. As the investigation intensified around him, he knew he couldn't stay. So he made his final desperate move. He took his 3 sons, the last living pieces of the family he had destroyed, and he fled. The escape became a frantic cross-border dash for freedom. Josimar Cabrera, with his 3 young sons in tow, had become a fugitive. He left Lancaster behind, driving south toward his destination, his native Peru, a country where he perhaps believed he could find refuge. He crossed the border into Mexico, then continued his journey south. A father and his 3 sons on what looked like a trip, but was actually a flight from justice. His journey wasn't without incident. In a frustrating twist of fate that would later infuriate investigators, Josimar was briefly detained twice, once in Mexico and once in Peru. Authorities in both countries had been alerted, but the legal machinery hadn't yet caught up. At the time of his detentions, he hadn't been formally charged with any crime in the United States. He was a person of interest, a man connected to a suspicious disappearance. But there was no warrant for his arrest. Police had no legal grounds to hold him. They had to let him go. It was a maddening near miss, a case of the suspect staying one step ahead of the law. He had slipped right through their fingers. Back in Los Angeles, the investigation had become a race against time. While homicide detectives worked to build their case, A massive search operation launched in the vast, rugged wilderness of the Angeles National Forest. This was the logical place to look. A sprawling, sparsely populated area where a person or body could easily disappear. The Montrose Search and Rescue Team, a group of highly skilled volunteers accustomed to searching for lost hikers, was now tasked with a much grimmer mission. They combed through canyons and ravines, their eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of disturbance, any clue that might lead them to Sheila. They knew what they were looking for. They had seen the video. They were searching for a bundle, a piece of material that matched the one seen being dragged from the apartment complex. On August 16th, 6 days after Sheila was killed, a search team member spotted something over the side of an embankment. It was a piece of fabric, partially hidden by scrub brush. As they got closer, their hearts sank. It was a bundle, just as described. The material was a perfect match to the drapes or blanket from the video. Homicide investigators were called to the scene. The area was cordoned off, and the grim task of recovery began. They carefully unwrapped the material, and there they found the body of Sheila Cabrera. Her life, which had begun with so much hope and promise, had ended here, discarded on a lonely hillside like a piece of trash. The cause of death wasn't immediately apparent, but the identity of the victim was not in doubt. The search was over. Sheila had been found. The same day her body was discovered, a small measure of relief came in the form of news from Peru. The 3 Cabrera children had been located. They were safe. They were taken into protective custody, their ordeal as fugitives finally over. But their long journey of healing from the trauma of losing both their parents, one to death, the other to the crime that caused it, was just beginning. The discovery of Sheila's body was the final piece of the puzzle. The circumstantial case against Josimar Cabrera was now overwhelming. On August 21st, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office formally charged him with 1 count of murder, with the special allegation that he had used a knife as a deadly weapon. An extradition warrant was issued. The international manhunt was officially on. José Cabrera was no longer just a person of interest. He was a wanted murderer. There was nowhere left for him to run. The walls were closing in on Josimar Cabrera. He was a fugitive in his own homeland, his face now circulating on news reports in both the United States and Peru. The pressure was mounting. The international cooperation between the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, the FBI, and Peruvian authorities, including Interpol, had turned his sanctuary into a trap. Then, on Wednesday, August 27th, just over 2 weeks after he had fled, the manhunt came to a sudden and unexpected end. Josimar Cabrera Cornejo, the man who had so brazenly tried to outrun his crime, walked into the Interpol headquarters in Lima and surrendered. The act of surrender was a quiet admission of defeat. The bravado and arrogance that had fueled his escape had crumbled, replaced by the cold, hard reality of his situation. He was a man with no options left. Peruvian authorities released a photo of him in custody, a stark and final image of a killer brought to justice. He's seen in handcuffs, wearing a t-shirt emblazoned with the Interpol logo, his face a mask of resignation. When the news of his capture broke, a wave of profound relief washed over everyone whose lives had been touched by this heartbreaking tragedy. For Sheila's devoted friends back in Lancaster, this moment marked the end of their relentless fight for answers. For her grieving family in Peru, it signaled the start of what would be a long, painful journey through the legal system. Difficult, yes, but absolutely necessary. The law enforcement officers who had poured countless hours into this complex international investigation finally saw their tireless work pay off. But even with José Cabrera now behind bars, the path to true justice stretched far ahead. He sat in custody thousands of miles away in Peru, and bringing him back to face trial in the United States would prove to be an exhausting process, one that would take months, not weeks. There he would remain, locked away in a Peruvian jail, caught in legal limbo as he waited to return to the country where he had committed his terrible crime. For Sheila's family, this waiting period brought its own crushing weight. Her mother, Helga, now carried an overwhelming burden, caring for 3 orphaned grandchildren while trying to navigate the bewildering complexities of an international murder case. "I'm very depressed, but I have to be strong for my grandchildren," she shared, her voice carrying both a grandmother's unwavering love and a mother's devastating grief. If convicted as charged, Josar Cabrera faces a possible maximum sentence of 26 years to life in a California state prison. For many who knew and loved Sheila, no sentence could ever truly balance the scales for the life he so brutally stole away. The case of Sheila Cabrera tells a haunting story of domestic violence, a stark reminder of the terror that can lurk behind the mask of what appears to be a normal family. But it's also a powerful testament to the strength of community, to a group of friends who simply refused to let their beloved friend's disappearance fade into silence. Their persistence and courage became the driving force that helped bring her killer to justice. Sheila's dream of building a better life in America ended in the most tragic way anyone could imagine. Yet, in her death, she became a voice for the countless other victims of domestic violence who suffer in silence. Her story, carried across airwaves and splashed across headlines, transformed into something greater. A rallying cry, a demand for justice, and an urgent call to action. The fight for Sheila is far from over. It will continue in a Los Angeles courtroom, and her memory will live on forever in the hearts of those who loved her, a permanent, shining light that no act of darkness could ever truly extinguish. Story 4. The Texas Panhandle stretches endlessly beneath an enormous sky. This vast, wind-swept expanse holds a stark beauty where horizons seem to go on forever, and only the whisper of wind through tall grass breaks the profound silence. In this remote corner of the world, life flows at nature's pace, shaped by changing seasons and the honest work of farming and ranching. Here, in a small farmhouse along Highway 70 just outside Pampa, the Conrad family had built their life together. Michelle Conrad was the heart of their home, a woman whose warm smile and gentle spirit anchored everything around her. 6 months pregnant with their 3rd child, she carried new life within her, a living symbol of hope and tomorrow. Her husband Brian worked the land with calloused hands, a man of the earth whose quiet strength and steady presence supported his family through everything. Together, they were raising 2 children. There was Zach Don, Michelle's son from before, a bright and spirited boy just beginning to discover his place in the world, and 10-year-old Robin Dawn, a girl whose spirit stretched as wide and open as the Texas sky itself. Robin bubbled with life and laughter. She adored her family, her friends, and all her animals. As a proud member of the 4-H club, she poured her heart into raising goats, pigs, and sheep. She understood the deep satisfaction that comes from a hard day's work, and found pure joy in watching sunsets paint the plains in golden light. Her world was woven from school days, farm chores, and the endless love of her family. The Conrads were the picture of an all-American family, their lives a living testament to hard work, community, and faith. Everyone in Pampa knew and respected them. Their farmhouse stood as a beacon of warmth and love against the vast, empty landscape. The night of September 29th, 2005, began like countless others. The family gathered for dinner, sharing stories and laughter around their table. Michelle set the coffee pot to brew automatically for morning, one of those small details that spoke to the comfortable rhythm of their lives. As darkness settled over the Panhandle, the family prepared for bed. Their farmhouse glowed like a warm beacon against the inky blackness surrounding them. Robin snuggled into her bed and drifted towards sleep, her dreams filled with the colorful fantasies of childhood. But this night, those innocent dreams would shatter into an all-too-real nightmare. The first sound that tore through the silence was the violent splintering of wood. The east door exploded inward under brutal force, giving way to a figure shrouded in darkness. The intruder stepped inside, a man whose heart burned with rage and whose soul had been stripped of all mercy. He gripped an AK-47 rifle in his hands and moved with terrifying purpose, each footstep like a drum beat of approaching doom. Robin jolted awake to the sound of gunshots, sharp, deafening cracks that echoed through their small farmhouse. At first, she thought it was part of a dream, some lingering echo from a nightmare. But then, she heard her mother's screams, a sound of pure terror that sliced through the night and froze her blood. More gunshots followed the screams, a relentless storm of violence that seemed to stretch on forever. Cold, sharp fear seized Robin's heart. She scrambled from her bed and crouched by her door, her small body shaking uncontrollably. Heavy, deliberate footsteps stomped through the house. The sounds grew closer, and Robin knew with a certainty that defied her young years. The intruder was coming for her. In desperate self-preservation, she leaped back into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, her body frozen in absolute terror. Her bedroom door creaked open. A dark figure filled the doorway. Robin squeezed her eyes shut tight, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She heard the rifle click, then the deafening roar of 2 gunshots. Searing pain shot through her left leg and arm as a bullet grazed her skin. The second bullet missed, striking a plastic drawer beside her bed with a loud crack. Robin lay perfectly still, holding her breath. She played dead, a desperate gamble for her life. The intruder, believing he had finished everyone in the house, turned and walked away. Robin heard him enter her brother's room. Then came the sickening sound of more gunshots. She heard Zach moan, a sound that would echo in her memory forever. For 2.5 hours, Robin remained motionless in that bed, a silent witness to the horror that had destroyed her world. The silence that followed the gunshots felt more terrifying than all the noise before it. Heavy and suffocating, it pressed down on her, filled with the ghosts of her family. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside sent fresh waves of terror coursing through her. But as the hours crawled by, something new began rising from the depths of her fear. A fierce, unbreakable will to survive. She knew she couldn't stay in that bed forever. She had to do something. She had to get help. With a courage that seemed impossible for someone so young, Robin slipped quietly out of bed and crept through the darkened house. What she discovered was beyond anything a child should ever witness. Her mother, stepfather, and brother lay motionless where they had fallen, their lives taken in an instant. Even Molly, their beloved family dog, hadn't been spared. Tears poured down Robin's face, but somehow she pushed through the overwhelming grief and terror. She knew she had to be strong. She was the only one left. She was the sole survivor. With shaking hands, she found the phone and dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's voice cut through the darkness like a lifeline, calm and reassuring. Robin's voice came out as barely a whisper, small and frightened. There was a shootout in my house, and I don't know who's dead, and I'm scared half to death. Sharon, the operator on the other end, felt her heart sink as she listened. She could hear everything in that little girl's voice, the raw terror, the unfiltered fear of a child who had witnessed something unthinkable. Is there anybody else in the house with you? Sharon asked gently, keeping her voice steady. No, I think I'm the only one alive, Robin replied, her voice cracking. I don't know, but I'm scared. I want my mom. Those words hung in the silence, a heartbreaking plea from a little girl who had lost everything. Sharon's heart ached for her, but she knew she had to stay focused. Robin needed help, and she needed it fast. Somebody's coming, honey. Somebody's coming, Sharon promised, her voice becoming Robin's lifeline in the darkness. For what felt like forever, Robin waited. clutching the phone. The cold seemed to seep into her very bones as she huddled in a corner, her eyes searching the darkness, her heart racing at every sound. She gave Sharon her address, each word carrying the weight of hope. "It's on Highway 70. It's about 3 miles out from the bowling alley. I have a purple shirt on. I have purple pants on." The details were so clear, so precise. A testament to the incredible composure of a 10-year-old girl who had just survived the unthinkable. Texas State Trooper Chad Brooks was first to arrive. He'd seen his share of tragedy as a deputy sheriff, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. As he turned down the long, dark driveway, he spotted a small figure standing in the yard. A child in purple, still on the phone, her face streaked with tears. Robin ran straight to him, her small body collapsing into his arms. She clung to him as sobs shook her entire frame. Chad held her tight, his heart breaking for this brave little girl who had endured so much. "He told me everything was going to be okay," Robin would later remember. They were going to figure it out. Chad knew he couldn't let her go back into that house. He had to keep her safe. Gently, he placed her in his patrol car and secured the doors. A small but crucial step in a situation still filled with danger. As more officers arrived, they began clearing the house, weapons drawn, faces grim. Inside, they found a scene of devastating violence. Brian had been shot 3 times, Michelle 6 times, and Zach 3 times. Even the family dog had been shot twice. Bullet casings were scattered everywhere, telling the story of a brutal, senseless attack. The investigators were puzzled. The Conrads were a beloved family with no known enemies. There were no signs of robbery, no clear motive. It was a crime that made no sense, one that had shattered the peace of their quiet community. While the investigation continued, Chad stayed with Robin. He knew he needed to find some way to distract her from the horror surrounding them. When he asked if there was anything he could do for her, her answer surprised him. "I want to feed my animals," she said, her voice small but determined. Chad, who knew his way around farm animals, didn't hesitate. They walked together to the corral, and for just a few precious moments, Robin was simply a little girl again. Her face lit up as she talked about her goats and sheep. She even laughed when Chad tried to give the goats way too much alfalfa. But the moment was brief. As they left the corral, reality came crashing back, and Robin's laughter turned to tears. She grabbed Chad's arm, her small hand desperately seeking something solid in a world turned upside down. "Mom and Brian, they're not going to walk out of there, are they?" she whispered. The question hung in the air, a heartbreaking plea for a miracle that wouldn't come. The officers, their own hearts heavy with grief, had to tell her the truth. She was the only survivor. The news hit like a crushing blow, but Robin, showing a resilience that seemed almost miraculous, somehow held on. She was taken to her great-grandmother's house, where family and friends surrounded her with love and support. The house felt heavy with grief and disbelief. Everyone was crying, their voices rising together in a chorus of pain and confusion. Robin, still reeling from shock, couldn't answer their questions. She was just a little girl, scared and utterly alone. Her entire world had collapsed into one terrifying question. Why? The next day, Robin was taken to the Bridge, a children's advocacy center, where a trained professional interviewed her. The session was videotaped, creating a crucial piece of evidence for the investigation. Robin recounted what had happened the night before, her voice trembling with both fear and defiance. She described the intruder, his pale face and ghostly white eyes, an image that would be burned into her memory forever. She told the advocate she had heard 15 gunshots, a detail investigators later confirmed when they found 15 fired rounds scattered throughout the house. As the investigation into the Conrad family murders moved forward, law enforcement officers hit a dead end. They had no suspects, no clear motive, and very little physical evidence to work with. The killer had left behind shoe prints and tire tracks, but no fingerprints or DNA. The shell casings came from an AK-47, but that was all they had. Fear gripped the community of Pampa. People locked their doors tight, their sense of security completely shattered. A killer was out there somewhere, a monster who had targeted an innocent family for no apparent reason. Meanwhile, 500 miles away in Pennyville, Missouri, another family was dealing with a similar tragedy. Just one day before the Conrad family murders, the bodies of Orly McCool and his daughter-in-law Dawn were discovered in their home. They had been shot and killed, their house ransacked. The local sheriff's department, led by Sheriff Michael Hall, launched their investigation. At the McCool crime scene, investigators found shell casings from an unusual type of ammunition, a Russian brand that wasn't commonly available. One of the deputies, Don Ruby, recognized the ammunition immediately. He had just taken a burglary report from a man named Scott King who lived down the road. Scott King had reported that his son, Levi King, had broken into his gun safe and stolen several firearms, along with some of the exact same ammunition found at the McCool crime scene. Levi King was no stranger to law enforcement. At 23 years old, he already had a long history of troubling behavior. He'd been in prison for arson and burglary, sentenced to 14 years, but serving less than 3 before being transferred to a halfway house. He had escaped from that halfway house just 1 week before the McCool murders. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Investigators discovered that Orly and Dawn McCool's Dodge Dakota pickup truck was missing. They issued a nationwide alert for the stolen vehicle. The very next day, Levi King was captured by Border Patrol in El Paso, Texas. He was driving the stolen truck with guns in the back. King was taken into custody and questioned by El Paso police. Just 15 minutes into the interview, he confessed to murdering Orly and Dawn McCool. But he described the killings in a chillingly detached way, his voice completely empty of emotion. He claimed he had been scared and panicked, a hollow excuse for such brutal and senseless violence. Deputy Don Ruby, who had known Levi King since he was a child, traveled to El Paso to bring him back to Missouri. During that long drive, King made a statement that sent shivers down Ruby's spine. He said the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood was better than any substance he'd ever tried. A few weeks later, while sitting in a Missouri jail cell, Levi King asked to speak with Deputy Ruby. They met in the outdoor exercise yard, and during their conversation, King made a stunning confession. "You know there's 4 more in Texas?" he asked casually, as if he were discussing the weather. He described where the bodies could be found, near a large cross in the Texas Panhandle. Ruby knew exactly the location King was talking about. He immediately contacted the Texas authorities, and the 2 cases were finally connected. The random, senseless murders of the Conrad family now had a face and a name: Levi King. The news shocked the Texas investigators. They had been desperately searching for a motive, some reason behind the brutal attack on the Conrad family. But there was no motive, no reason at all. Levi King was simply a killer who killed for the thrill of it. After murdering the McCools and stealing their truck, he had driven 500 miles with the urge to kill still burning inside him. He had pulled off the interstate in Pampa, spotted the isolated Conrad farmhouse, and decided it was time to kill again. With King's confession, the mystery of the Conrad family murders was finally solved. But for Rob and Dawn, the ordeal was far from over. She would have to face her family's killer in a court of law, a prospect that filled her with both dread and fierce determination. Levi King was first tried in Missouri for the murders of Orly and Dawn McCool. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But in Texas, District Attorney Lynn Switzer refused to take the death penalty off the table. She believed that if ever there was a case that warranted the ultimate punishment, this was it. The Texas trial began 4 years after the murders. Robin was 14 years old, on the verge of turning 15. She was a young woman now, her childhood stolen from her by a man who had shown no mercy. She knew she had to testify. She had to be the voice for her family. The defense attorney, Jor Wilson, faced a nearly impossible task. He had to humanize a man who had committed monstrous acts. He painted a picture of Levi King as a product of his environment, a young man who had grown up in crushing poverty and despair, surrounded by drugs, violence, and a culture of guns. King had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, depression, and at times schizophrenia. He was a deeply disturbed individual, Wilson argued, a victim of his own twisted mind. But the prosecution, led by Lynn Switzer, struck back hard. King's troubled upbringing was no excuse for his actions. There were countless people who grew up in similar circumstances and didn't become killers. Levi King, she argued, was a predator who enjoyed the act of killing. He was a man who deserved to die for his crimes. The day of Robin's testimony arrived like a storm cloud. She was terrified to be in the same room as the man who had destroyed her life. As she took the stand, she tried to avoid looking at him. But eventually, her curiosity got the better of her. She wanted to see the face of the monster who had haunted her dreams for the past 4 years. She looked at him, and he stared back at her. His eyes were cold and empty. A look that chilled her to the core. A look she would never forget. But as she began to speak, something remarkable happened. Her fear gave way to quiet strength. She told her story, her voice clear and steady, her words a powerful testament to the love she had for her family. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. In the end, they couldn't reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. One juror held out, and Levi King was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was extradited back to Missouri to serve his sentences. For Robin, the verdict was a form of victory. Her family's killer would never walk free again. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a prisoner of his own making. In the years that followed, Robin struggled to rebuild her life. The scars of that night ran deep, both physical and emotional. She had nightmares. She was afraid of the dark, and she could no longer sleep with her door open. The dates of her family's birthdays became constant reminders of her loss. She missed her mother, her stepfather, and her brother with a pain that was raw and unrelenting. Robin Dunn's story is one of unimaginable tragedy and incredible resilience. It's the story of a little girl who faced the darkest of evils and emerged with a spirit that could not be broken. It's a story of the enduring power of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the unyielding will to survive. The scars of that night will always be with her, a constant reminder of the family she lost. But they're also a testament to the strength she found within herself. The strength to not only survive, but to truly live. Story 5. The quiet town of Russellville, Arkansas, nestled peacefully in the river valley, a place where life moved with a gentle, predictable rhythm. This was a town built on Friday night football games and Sunday morning church services, where a close-knit community meant everyone knew everyone else. In the heart of this seemingly perfect setting, 19-year-old Nana Dirks was carving out her own bright future, one as promising as a southern sunrise. As a music major at Arkansas Tech University, Nona's days overflowed with the melodies of her studies and the warmth of lasting friendships. But she was so much more than just a college student. She was a beauty queen, the reigning Miss Petite Jean Valley, and a contestant in the prestigious Miss Arkansas pageant. Her beauty was undeniable. Cascading blonde hair framed a face that could light up any room. Yet those who knew her best saw a beauty that ran far deeper than the surface. Nona was kind, compassionate, and possessed a quiet strength forged through a difficult past. As a child, she had endured trauma at the hands of her biological father, a painful secret she carried for years. When her father died at age 10, only then did her mother Carol learn the truth about what had happened. This painful chapter didn't break her spirit. Instead, it ignited a passion within her to become a voice for the voiceless. Through her pageants, she made child abuse prevention her platform, a powerful testament to her resilience and her desire to protect others from the pain she had known. Despite her outward success and poise on stage, Nona remained a shy soul at heart. That's where Kevin Jones came in, helping her find confidence she never knew she had. They were inseparable, a young couple whose love story wove itself into the very fabric of their small-town life. Kevin's mother, Janice, a school librarian, witnessed the positive influence they had on each other. Nona made her son kinder and sweeter, while Kevin gave her confidence and cheered her on through every struggle. Their bond ran deep and unshakable. Kevin was the one she trusted with her deepest secrets, the one she told about the abuse she'd suffered. He knew without question that he would marry her someday. By summer 2005, they had completed their first year of college together at Arkansas Tech. But change was coming. Kevin was transferring to the University of Arkansas, a 90-minute drive away. The distance felt difficult, but their love remained strong. Kevin lived for the weekends, for that familiar comfort of being back home with Nona Dada. December 15th, 2005, began like any other winter day. Christmas spirit filled the air throughout Russellville, and Kevin was back in town from college. He and Nona had already spent time together, and he was expecting to hear from her after she finished a final exam. As the hours ticked by, his calls and messages went unanswered. A knot of unease began tightening in his stomach. This wasn't like her. He could always reach Nona. By evening, his concern had turned into gnawing anxiety. He'd promised to escort his mother to a school holiday dinner, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Mom, I can't go to this party wondering if she's okay," he told Janice. He called his friend Ryan, who was delivering pizzas in the area, asking him to check if Nona's car was parked outside her apartment. It was there. Ryan knocked on the door of apartment 12 at the Colony Apartments, but got no answer. That was enough. Kevin and his mother raced to Nona's apartment, their hearts pounding with fear. When they arrived, Kevin and Ryan tried the front door. Locked. They ran around back to the sliding glass door. In a surge of adrenaline, Kevin forced the door open and rushed inside. The sight that awaited him was pure nightmare, a scene of unimaginable horror that would forever scar his memory. Nona, his beloved Nona, lay on the floor of her living room, her life brutally taken from her. He rushed to her side, turning her over, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. The apartment's silence shattered with a frantic 911 call, a desperate plea for help that came far too late. When first responders arrived, they encountered a scene of devastating violence. Nona Dirks was gone, beaten with the heavy metal base of a floor lamp that now lay just feet from her body. The apartment showed no signs of break-in, but clear evidence of a violent struggle filled every corner. And there was Kevin Jones, his hands and clothes covered in Nona's blood. In the cold, hard reality of murder investigations, there's one rule that cuts straight to the heart of things. Look to the partner first. When someone in a relationship turns up dead, the one left behind almost always becomes suspect number one. And that's exactly where the Russellville police turned their attention, straight to Kevin Jones. Everything about him seemed wrong. His appearance, the fact that he was right there at the scene, those blood-soaked clothes clinging to his body. It all painted a picture that was hard to ignore. James Bacon, who was running the Russellville Police Department back then, arrived as one of the first officers on scene. What he witnessed that day stuck with him. Kevin's behavior just didn't sit right. When I walked into that apartment, there he was, standing just inside the doorway. Bacon would later recall. He actually stuck his hand out like he wanted to shake mine, then suddenly stopped and said, "Oh, I can't." Then he held up his hands like this, showing me they were completely covered in blood. That same night, Kevin found himself spending hours at the police station. He answered every question they threw at him, no lawyer in sight. In his mind, he had absolutely nothing to hide. But while Kevin sat alone in that stark interrogation room, a hidden camera captured his every gesture, every moment of frustration. At one point, overwhelmed by it all, he slammed his hand against the back of a chair. To the watching officers, this wasn't just frustration. It was a window into something darker. Tells me he definitely has the capability of striking somebody, or at least striking something, Bacon would say later. Slowly but surely, the police began weaving together their version of what happened that night. They painted a picture of passion turned deadly. A fight that spiraled completely out of control. The medical examiner's findings seemed to support their theory. Nona had suffered blows to her face, injuries that looked like they came from an open-handed strike. The investigators believed the killer had even pulled out a knife at some point but couldn't bring himself to use it. To them, this hesitation screamed of a personal connection. Someone who knew and cared about Nona Dara. The violence had escalated from there, ending with that final fatal blow from the floor lamp. But the question that haunted everyone was simple. Why? Why would Kevin, the same boy who'd fallen for Nona back in high school, the man who was planning to spend his life with her, suddenly explode in such murderous fury? The police believe they found their answer sitting right there on Nona's kitchen counter. An empty condom wrapper. Kevin had been clear about one thing during questioning. He and Nona never used protection. That little piece of packaging became the spark in their theory, the thing that lit the fuse of jealousy. They were convinced Kevin had discovered Nona was seeing other men. And in that moment of discovery, rage had consumed him completely. It didn't take the investigators long to confirm what they suspected. Nona had indeed been involved with other men. They tracked down each of these other lovers, interviewed them thoroughly, but cleared every single one. No matter which direction they looked, all roads kept leading back to Kevin. The night before Nona's funeral, Kevin made a decision that showed just how desperate he was to clear his name. He walked back into that police station completely on his own. "I'll do anything you guys want me to do," he told them, his voice heavy with determination. "I'll take a DNA test. I'll do anything." He even agreed to take a lie detector test, a choice that would come back to haunt him in ways he never imagined. When it was over, the investigators delivered crushing news. They'd told him he'd failed that polygraph test miserably. Then came what the police considered their ace in the hole, their smoking gun. There, on the light bulb of the very lamp used to end Nona's life, hidden among the bloodstains, was a palm print. And it was a perfect match to Kevin Jones. The only way that print could have gotten there is during the crime itself, an investigator told him, his words cutting through the room like a blade. "That's the only way, and it's yours." In the police theory, as Kevin had struck Nona again and again with that lamp, it had shattered in the violence. In his desperate scramble to keep hold of the makeshift weapon, he pressed his bloody palm right against that bulb. They'd also developed another theory about Kevin's actions when he'd discovered the body. All that rushing in, touching Nona, cradling her. They saw it as something far more calculated. A deliberate attempt to muddy the waters and contaminate the evidence. 6 days after the murder shattered the quiet of Russellville, lead detective Mark Frost laid out the harsh reality for Kevin. He was their only suspect. The full weight of that accusation hit him like a physical blow. "At first I was terrified," Kevin would remember later. "These are the police we're talking about. They have incredible power. The power to lock someone away for the rest of their life if they choose to. But then something shifted in my mind. I thought, no, I didn't do this terrible thing. They can't possibly put me in prison for something I never did. Now, son!" But the prosecutor wasn't quite ready to pull the trigger on formal charges. Kevin, now living under the crushing weight of suspicion, walked free for the time being. When the day of Nona's funeral arrived, Kevin was there among the mourners. But he might as well have been invisible, or worse, a ghost that everyone wished would disappear. He stood there the next day, isolated in that sea of grief, a pariah among people who had once known him. Nona's mother, Carol, and her stepfather, Dwayne Dippert, had made up their minds about Kevin's guilt. The transformation was heartbreaking. This boy they'd once welcomed into their family with open arms was now, in their eyes, the monster who'd stolen their daughter's life. Kevin was crying, Carol would remember. And I said, "Don't let him sit with me, Lee." Dwayne saw those tears as nothing more than an act, dismissing Kevin as a con artist and master manipulator. On March 31st, 2006, more than 3 long months after Nona's death had torn through the community, Kevin Jones found himself in handcuffs. He was officially charged with her murder. The people of Russellville had already made up their minds about his guilt. 18 months after that terrible night when Nona died, Kevin's trial finally began. His defense team, worried sick about the poisoned atmosphere in town, successfully argued for a change of venue. The trial would move to the nearby town of Ozark. Deputy Prosecutor Jeff Phillips led the charge for the state, building the entire case around that bloody palm print on the light bulb. For Carol, who everyone simply called Mother, even a life sentence wouldn't be enough justice. "Kevin is a murderer," she declared, her voice filled with pain and fury, "and he deserves to forfeit his life." The trial became an epic battle of stories, a clash between 2 completely different versions of the truth. At first, the jury seemed to be leaning toward the prosecution's narrative. The palm print was a big factor, juror Jennifer Finley would admit later. "You bet," said juror Kim Wilhite, when asked if she initially thought Kevin was guilty. "Statistically, it's usually someone close to the person. And here they had the boyfriend, and they had him with the bloody palm print. The entire case came down to that light bulb. More specifically, it hinged on the texture of the blood when it was discovered. Was it wet, or was it dry? If it was dry, it would support the prosecution's theory that the print was left hours earlier during the murder. If it was still wet or tacky, it would back up Kevin's claim that the print was left when he tried to revive Nona just before police arrived. The word police used to describe the blood was tacky. Chief Bacon himself said it could have been tacky. This single word became a powerful weapon for the defense. The prosecution's own blood expert, Tom Beville, admitted that if the blood was tacky, it certainly could not have been deposited there at the time of death. The defense team hammered this point home, arguing that the tackiness of the blood proved Kevin was telling the truth. Then, there was the condom wrapper. Police had chosen to test it for fingerprints, a process that could potentially destroy DNA evidence. No fingerprints were found, but Kevin's legal team didn't stop there. They had what was left of the wrapper tested for DNA. The results were explosive. The DNA was male, but it did not belong to Kevin Jones. The defense also exposed a series of missteps by police. The most glaring was what happened to Nona's cell phone. In the middle of the murder investigation, lead investigator Mark Frost gave the phone to Nona's stepfather, Dwayne Dippert. Dippert, by his own admission a cheapskate, started deleting Nona's numbers and putting his own in. Potentially crucial evidence was lost forever. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They laid out a timeline, pored over the evidence, and debated the conflicting theories. In the end, they reached a decision. Not guilty. "I felt like 10,000 pounds had been lifted off my shoulders," Kevin said. Nona's family was devastated. "You got away with it, Kevin. You got away with it," Dwayne Dippert said as he stood up in the courtroom. But the jury was clear. "There just wasn't enough to convict," explained juror Kim Wilhite. "There wasn't anything that pointed to Kevin as the killer. Kevin Jones was a free man, but the shadow of suspicion lingered. In the eyes of the law, he was not guilty. But in the court of public opinion, particularly in his small hometown, the verdict was less clear. His mother, Janice, however, had made a promise to both her son and to Nona. She would not rest until the real killer was found. After the trial, Kevin's defense team continued their work. They had a crucial piece of evidence, the DNA from the condom wrapper. They kept searching for a match, and on February 6, 2008, they found one. A special prosecutor was appointed, and a new investigation began. The DNA matched a man named Gary Dunn, a 28-year-old who at the time of the murder had been a neighbor living in the same apartment complex. More chillingly, Dunn was on parole. He had served 6 years in prison for a 2002 incident where he had brutally beaten a female jogger with a large tree branch and threatened to kill her. He had been released from prison just 4 months before Nona was murdered. Suddenly, the pieces of a different, more terrifying puzzle began to fall into place. Dunn had a history of extreme violence against women. His wife came forward with a damning detail. A few weeks before the murder, she had caught him spying on Nona through her window. The prosecution now had a new theory. Gary Dunn had become fixated on Nona de Cherchir. He entered her apartment, possibly under some pretext, and when his advances were rejected, he flew into a rage and killed her, just as he had attacked the jogger years before. Gary Dunn was arrested and charged with the capital murder of Nona Dirks. But the case against him, like the one against Kevin, was largely circumstantial. The defense disputed the DNA evidence, and 2 separate jury trials both ended in hung juries. After spending nearly 2 years in jail, Gary Dunn was released. 10 years passed. The case grew cold, a lingering wound in the heart of Russellville. Then on December 4th, 2018, the name Gary Dunn resurfaced. The Russellville police received reports of 2 separate incidents: an attempted kidnapping of a woman and an act of indecent exposure in front of another. The descriptions of the suspect led them to Dunn. He was arrested and eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison for the attempted kidnapping. The murder of Nona Dirks remains officially unsolved. A beloved daughter, a promising student, and a compassionate young woman was brutally killed in her own home. 2 men were accused. 2 trials were held, but no one was ever convicted of her murder. Gary Dunn, the man whose DNA was found at the scene and who had a history of violent attacks on women, is in prison, but not for killing Nona. For Nona's family and the community that still grieves her loss, there can be no true peace. The haunting question lingers in the silence. Does her killer still walk among us, free? Or perhaps a flawed investigation let him slip through the cracks of justice, leaving behind only shadows and doubt that time itself may never be able to wash away. Story 6. In the quiet coastal town of Brighton, where sea breezes carried whispers of ordinary lives, Shauna Grace moved through the vibrant chaos of young adulthood with an infectious energy that drew people like moths to a flame. At 19, she was the kind of girl who could light up any room without even trying. Her laughter would ring through crowded pubs, her dark hair flowing over shoulders that carried dreams yet to unfold. Born to Sharon Grace and Richard Green, Shauna had grown up wrapped in the warmth of a close-knit family. Her childhood overflowed with simple seaside joys and unbreakable bonds with her grandparents. She was bright, bubbly, and kind-hearted. The sort of person who made friends effortlessly and treasured every moment with those she loved. Her enthusiasm for life was impossible to miss. She spoke with a confidence that seemed beyond her years, her voice clear and steady, carrying the promise of a future brimming with possibility. Shauna's world centered around her loved ones and her passions. She worked part-time at a local salon, where her gentle touch and warm smile transformed routine appointments into cherished conversations. Her weekends became a whirlwind of social adventures, dancing with friends under the neon glow of Brighton's nightlife, or sharing quiet evenings with her long-term boyfriend, Ashley Cook. Ashley was her steady anchor, the kind of partner who kept her grounded amid the swirl of young romance. They'd been together for years, their relationship settling into a comfortable rhythm of shared secrets and inside jokes. Shauna's family absolutely adored him. He blended seamlessly into their gatherings, weaving himself into the tapestry of normalcy that defined her days. But beneath this perfect surface, shadows were beginning to stir. shadows cast by a man who would soon unravel everything she held dear. Michael Lane entered Shauna's life like a storm cloud on a clear day, uninvited and impossible to ignore. At 27, he was older than the boys she typically dated, carrying himself with a quiet intensity that seemed intriguing at first. He worked as a technician at a nearby engineering firm, a job that kept him busy with precise, methodical tasks. How ironic, given how his life would soon spiral into dangerous obsession. Michael carried a history that whispered of instability, though Shauna wouldn't discover the full truth until it was far too late. He'd been involved in youth groups, even volunteering as a scout leader years earlier. But those roles had ended amid troubling whispers of inappropriate behavior. Reports would later surface of him harassing young women, bombarding them with explicit messages, loitering outside their homes. But these incidents had disappeared into the bureaucratic fog of uncharged allegations. Their paths crossed in early 2015 at a mutual friends gathering in Hove, just a short drive from Brighton's bustling streets. Shauna, fresh from a night out with her girlfriends, had laughed off the introductions at first. Michael lingered at the edges of the group, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her pause. He seemed polite, almost charming in his awkward way, sharing stories of his travels and his love for tinkering with gadgets. Shauna, ever the friendly soul, engaged him in conversation, completely unaware that this casual exchange would ignite a fixation in him that bordered on possession. What started as innocent flirtation quickly escalated. Michael began texting her constantly, his messages heavy with compliments that soon turned demanding. "You're special, Shauna," he'd write deep into the night. "No one understands you like I do." She responded at first, flattered by the attention. But as weeks passed, the messages piled up, demanding replies even when she was out with Ashley or fast asleep. By mid-2015, Shauna found herself caught in a relationship with Michael that she hadn't fully anticipated. It was passionate but unbalanced, marked by his jealousy and her growing unease. He pried into her life with Ashley, questioning every mention of her boyfriend with a sharpness that deeply unsettled her. Shauna confided in friends like Joe and Pombre, a close confidant from work, about the mixed feelings swirling inside her. "He's so intense," she'd say, her voice touched with hesitation. "But I don't know if this is right." Michael, meanwhile, began weaving himself into her daily routine. He'd appear unannounced at her favorite cafe on Boundary Road, claiming coincidence, or linger outside her modest home on Chris Road in Portslade, a quiet residential street lined with terraced houses where the hum of daily life masked deeper troubles. Shauna's home was her sanctuary, a cozy two-bedroom space shared with roommates who came and went, leaving the place filled with her personal touches. Framed photos of family vacations, scented candles on the windowsill, and a bed piled high with soft pillows where she dreamed of independence. As autumn deepened, Michael's behavior shifted from attentive to controlling. He'd accuse her of cheating whenever she mentioned plans with friends. His texts escalated from pleas to outright demands. "Why won't you leave him?" The messages kept coming, his words sharp with resentment about Ashley. Shauna tried pulling away, blocking his number for a while. But Michael always found another way through. New phones, different accounts. His relentless pursuit wore her down like waves battering the Sussex cliffs. Late one evening in 2015, after a heated argument spilled out from a local pub, Michael's hand clamped around her arm. His grip left marks she'd later hide beneath long sleeves. She forgave him then, telling herself it was just passion that had gotten out of hand. But somewhere deep inside, a seed of fear took root. By winter, their encounters had become a messy tangle of occasional meetups while she stayed with Ashley. The whole situation left Shauna feeling trapped and utterly confused. At 19, she simply didn't have the tools to recognize the danger signs. Her youthful hope kept her blind to all those red flags waving right in front of her. The new year brought no peace. January 2016 saw Michael's behavior take a darker turn. Without Shauna knowing, He'd slipped a GPS tracker onto her small blue hatchback, a device ordered online and carefully hidden beneath the car. Every few nights, he'd creep back to her street under cover of darkness, recharging the battery while she slept inside. His car would idle silently in the shadows, waiting like a predator. The tracker fed him every detail of her life. Gym visits, late shifts at the salon, evenings spent at Ashley's place. Jealousy slowly twisted into something far more dangerous. He slashed her tires once, deflating them in the dead of night, only to show up the next morning playing the helpful hero. Tools ready in his boot, offering to fix the damage he'd caused. Shauna accepted his help that time, her gratitude masking the growing dread that was building inside her. But by February, his intrusions had become impossible to ignore. Unwanted flowers appeared at her door, bouquets of roses with notes written in his careful handwriting. Thinking of you always. Fresh scratches appeared on her car, deliberate lines that screamed of rage. On February 8th, 2016, the weight of it all finally broke her. Shauna sat in her living room, winter chill creeping through the windows, and dialed Sussex police for the first time. Her voice shook as she described everything. The stalking, the flowers, the damage to her car, that constant feeling of being watched. The officer on the line was polite but distant, taking down her details and promising to give Michael a warning. Within hours, police knocked on his door at his flat in Burgess Hill, just a short drive away. Michael denied everything with wide-eyed innocence, claiming he knew nothing about any gifts or vandalism. The officers issued their verbal warning, "Stay away from Shauna Grace." He nodded solemnly, but inside, something darker was hardening. That evening, Shauna felt a flicker of relief. She called her mother Sharon, sharing how empowered she felt for finally speaking up. Sharon, who worked in administration and had always been devoted to her daughter, listened with deep concern. Her maternal instincts urged Shauna to stay alert. Neither of them knew this was just the beginning of a tragedy that would expose serious flaws in the very system meant to protect her. Spring arrived with gentle warmth, but Michael's obsession only grew stronger. He couldn't let go. Every attempt Shauna made to move forward only fueled his twisted belief that she belonged to him. In March, their paths crossed again at a local nightclub. The pounding bass couldn't mask the tension crackling between them. What started as a reluctant conversation ended in violence outside. Michael snatched her phone as she tried to call a cab, his fingers twisting in her hair, yanking her close with terrifying possessiveness. Pain shot through her scalp. Tears blurred the streetlights as she broke free and ran to a friend's car. Bruised and shaken, Shauna made it home and on March 24th, reported the assault to police once more. This time, officers took her statement in person. The harsh fluorescent lights of the station cast cold shadows across her face as she described the attack, the fear that had gripped her chest. She hoped desperately for their help. But Michael was ready. When police questioned him, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through a collection of intimate text messages from their past relationship. The explicit exchanges painted a picture of consent and mutual affection, convincing the officers that Shauna had left out a crucial detail: their romantic history. Instead of pursuing charges against him, they turned on her. "You should have mentioned you were involved," the investigating officer said, his tone sharp with accusation. Shauna, mortified and defensive, stumbled through explanations about how the relationship had soured, how his behavior had turned threatening. But the police saw deception, not desperation. They handed her a fixed penalty notice for wasting police time, a 90-pound fine that branded her a liar. As she left the station, head bowed against the drizzle, the sting of betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Michael walked free, more emboldened than ever, while Shauna carried the shame like a weight. She vowed silently never to trust the badge again. The fine hung over her like a storm cloud, eating away at her confidence. Her friends began to notice the change. Joan pulled her aside one afternoon at the salon, concern etching deep lines across her features. "You have to keep reporting him, Shauna. Don't let this stop you." But doubt had already crept in. Shauna's interactions with Michael became furtive, a careful mix of avoidance and reluctant responses to his relentless messages. He exploited the police's skepticism like a weapon, sending her cold, legalistic letters demanding repayment for debts from their time together. Small sums for dinners or rides twisted into veiled threats. By summer, his intrusions reached a terrifying peak. On July 9th, Shauna lay in bed as early morning light filtered softly through her curtains. Then she heard it, the soft click of her back door opening. Her heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps echoed up the stairs. She feigned sleep, pulling the duvet over her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps as her bedroom door slowly creaked open. Heavy breathing filled the silence. She felt eyes boring into her, a presence that violated every inch of her sacred space. Minutes stretched into what felt like eternity before the intruder finally slipped away. Peering through her window, she watched Michael's retreating figure, his shoulders hunched against the pale dawn light. Trembling, Shauna called the police immediately, her voice barely a whisper with fear. "This was about the theft of her spare key," she explained. "The one he'd swiped weeks earlier during what seemed like a friendly visit." Officers arrived and took her statement, but that earlier fine still loomed large over everything. Michael was arrested briefly for theft, but upon his release, he received only a caution and another meaningless warning to cease contact. No deeper investigation followed. The case was filed as low risk, the officers citing the complicated history from those text messages. Shauna's pleas fell on deaf ears. The very next day, July 10th, her phone buzzed relentlessly. 7 calls from a blocked number, each one ending in silence broken only by labored, heavy breathing. She reported again, desperation cracking her voice, but the response was curt. No further lines of inquiry. Case closed. On July 12th, she spotted him tailing her car through Brighton's busy traffic, his vehicle like a dark shadow in her rearview mirror. Another report. Another brush off. Low risk, they'd say, as if her terror was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The summer heat seemed to amplify her isolation. Shauna confided less in others, her bright spirit slowly dimming under the crushing weight of constant vigilance. She double-checked locks obsessively, varied her routes home, and leaned heavily on Ashley for comfort. Their evenings wrapped in each other's arms offered brief respite, but Michael still lurked somewhere out there, his obsession completely unchecked. He volunteered sporadically with youth groups again, a temporary glitch in the system allowing him back despite past red flags. A serious allegation from 2010 when he'd targeted a 14-year-old as a scout leader. Never prosecuted but noted in records that somehow went unseen. His disturbing pattern was crystal clear to anyone who bothered to look. 12 other women had endured his harassment over a full decade. Explicit texts, unwanted advances, incidents dismissed as simple misunderstandings. Yet, the police only saw fragments, never the complete mosaic of danger. August brought what seemed like a fragile turning point. On August 4th, Shauna saw Michael loitering outside her home, his dark silhouette against the setting sun sending ice-cold chills down her spine. She didn't report it this time, the memory of that fine effectively silencing her. Instead, she turned to Joanne, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "They won't believe me anymore. What if he finds me again?" Joanne urged her to keep fighting, but Shauna's resolve was wavering. 2 weeks later, on August 23rd, she confronted Michael at a hotel in Hove, ending things definitely. "It's over," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tight knot in her stomach. He stormed out, pure rage flashing in his eyes, but Shauna felt an unexpected surge of liberation. She spent the next day with Ashley, planning a much-needed getaway, her laughter returning in tentative bursts. Life, it seemed, might finally reclaim its natural rhythm. But Michael seethed in Burgess Hill, his mind a churning cauldron of rejection and twisted entitlement. The split had ignited his fury, jealousy over Ashley twisting into vengeful plots. He confided in a pub acquaintance, his words slurring with bitter resentment. "She'll pay for what she's done." On August 24th, he bought a can of petrol from a local station, claiming later it was for taking his own life, an implausible lie that would completely unravel in court. He carefully prepared a disguise, a high-visibility jacket, a peaked cap to shadow his face. By the morning of August 25th, his intent had crystallized into cold, calculated premeditation. Shauna's roommates had left for work early, leaving the house silent except for the distant crash of waves. She woke around 7:30 a.m., completely unaware of the shadow slipping through her unlocked door. Michael moved quietly through her home, taking a knife from her own kitchen, his steps muffled by the carpet. What happened in those fateful minutes remained shrouded in unspeakable horror. A neighbor heard a raised female voice, sharp but not screaming. Shauna's voice, perhaps pleading or protesting, knowing her attacker far too well to cry out for help. Michael struck without warning. The attack was swift and brutal, ending Shauna's life in those quiet morning moments. She was found beside her bed, her final moments stolen in the sanctuary of her own home. Conscious for those agonizing moments, she lay there as he rifled through her belongings, taking her bank cards with cold, mechanical detachment. He knew her PIN from their past relationship, a detail he'd stored away like a weapon, waiting for this moment. Now disguised in a hoodie pulled low over his cap, Michael slipped out into the morning air. He walked briskly to a nearby ATM on Graham Avenue. At 8:06 a.m., CCTV cameras captured his carefully averted face as he withdrew 60 euros, the remnants of Shauna's hard-earned savings. Those same notes would later be found in his car. No remorse slowed his steps. Instead, he drove to buy water, then transferred petrol into the bottle with calculated efficiency. At 8:22 a.m., bag in hand, he returned to the house. He moved Shauna's body onto the bed, dousing it and the room with accelerant. The acrid smell filled the air. With a flick of his lighter, flames erupted. The door clicked shut behind him as he fled. The fire roared briefly, heat blistering the walls, but oxygen depleted quickly in that confined space, smothering the blaze before it could consume everything. Smoke curled from the windows, a silent alarm drifting into the morning sky. Michael returned home, washing away the evidence, hiding clothes and shoes in trash bags he would later discard. Then he went to work, acting as if nothing had happened, maintaining this facade of normalcy until police arrived that afternoon. It was Ian Cook, Ashley's father, who had discovered what remained while checking on Shauna. The sight seared into his memory forever. Her form, the room transformed into a tomb of devastation. Michael was arrested at his workplace, his initial lies crumbling under the weight of evidence. CCTV footage, phone trackers, text messages, everything pointed to him. He admitted to the stalking but denied taking her life, claiming he'd found her that way, and simply panicked. The jury saw right through his deception. On March 23, 2017, at Lewis Crown Court, after a 2-week trial, he was convicted and sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years. The courtroom echoed with grief as Justice Green delivered his remarks, his voice heavy with condemnation. He described the crime as premeditated and cold-hearted, Michael's actions a betrayal of the vibrant life he'd stolen. Shauna's mother, Sharon, read a victim impact statement, her words breaking the courtroom silence. "We have lost our beautiful, kind, and thoughtful daughter. We miss her giggles and laughter." The judge then turned his attention to the police failures. his criticisms sharp and unforgiving. 5 complaints ignored. Shauna actually fined for seeking help. Stereotyped as the wrongdoer and what they saw as just a difficult relationship. Her vulnerability completely dismissed. The police jumped to conclusions, he said, noting how this skepticism led Michael to believe he could act with complete impunity. The Independent Police Complaints Commission investigated, uncovering Michael's disturbing history of harassing 13 women, including attempted grooming. Officers faced misconduct hearings. P.C. Mills was deemed grossly negligent for failing to review records before simply cautioning Michael. In the aftermath, Shauna's family fought tirelessly for accountability. Sharon and Richard challenged the coroner's decisions, seeking a full inquest, but lost in the High Court in 2020. The judge ruled that prior inquiries had been sufficient. Sussex police implemented changes: no more fines for domestic abuse reports, better training on stalking risks. But for Shauna's loved ones, these changes felt hollow. Her death had exposed systemic blind spots, the dangerous underestimation of coercive control, the dismissal of young women's fears. Sharon spoke publicly, her voice becoming a beacon for others. Shauna would still be alive if they just listened. Ashley mourned quietly, the void in her life immense. Friends like Joanne carried Shauna's memory forward, sharing stories of her unyielding spirit. Years on, the sea still laps at Brighton's shores, but Shauna's story lingers, a cautionary echo of unchecked obsession and institutional failure. Her life, cut short at just 19, reminds us of the fragility of trust and the devastating cost of indifference. In the faces of those she touched, her light endures, a testament to resilience amid unimaginable loss. Story 7. The city of Melbourne was just beginning to stir. On Little Burke Street, in the heart of the central business district, the early morning light painted long shadows across the pavement. For Juan Lai, a 36-year-old sushi chef, this was the quietest part of her day. A precious time for solitude and reflection before the frenetic pace of the kitchen took over. She had a deep passion for her craft, a precision and artistry that flowed into every piece of sushi she created. Her life was built on routine and dedication, early mornings and late nights, all devoted to her culinary calling. On the morning of October 2nd, 2025, Juan was walking to work, just as she did every day. She was less than 100 meters from her front door, following a familiar path she had taken countless times before. She was likely lost in thought, perhaps planning the day's menu or picturing the familiar faces of her regular customers. She was a woman who had carved out a life for herself in this vibrant city, a life of hard work and quiet satisfaction. But on this particular morning, her world was about to shatter. A figure emerged from the morning shadows. A woman with fiery red hair approached Juan from behind. The woman, 32-year-old Lauren Darrell, tapped Juan on the shoulder. As Juan turned around, she came face to face with a sight that would haunt her forever. A switchblade, glinting in the morning light. In an instant, the knife plunged into Juan's chest, a single, brutal act of violence that shattered the morning's peace. The attack was captured on a nearby CCTV camera, creating a chilling record of this random and brutal crime. The footage shows Darrow running up behind Juan, locking eyes with her for a fleeting moment before striking. Juan, stunned and in agony, clutches at her wound and sinks to the ground. A passerby, a stranger moved to action by the horrific scene, rushes to her side, offering his coat for warmth and comfort. The world that had been so ordered and predictable just moments before had dissolved into chaos, a whirlwind of pain, fear, and confusion. Juan was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered the full extent of her injuries. The knife had punctured her lung, causing a hemothorax, a life-threatening condition where blood and air filled her chest cavity. An emergency chest tube was inserted, draining 300 ml of blood from her lung. She was placed on a constant regimen of painkillers, antibiotics, and anti-nausea medication. The pain was so severe that she struggled to eat, chew, or even swallow. Every breath was agony, a constant reminder of the violence that had been inflicted upon her. While Juan fought for her life in the hospital, her family was plunged into a nightmare of their own. Her sister, Ivana Lai, a 39-year-old kindergarten assistant, became her fierce advocate, a tireless warrior in a battle she had never imagined she would have to fight. Just a day after the attack, Ivana began a desperate campaign to get help for her sister, to seek justice, and to hold someone, anyone, accountable for what had happened. She wrote a letter to the state government, a cry for help filled with a sister's love and a citizen's outrage. I am writing to file the strongest possible formal complaint regarding a horrific unprovoked knife attack, she wrote. My sister had walked less than 100 meters from her front door when she was randomly attacked with a switchblade and knocked to the ground by a female. Ivana's letter marked the beginning of a long and frustrating journey through the maze of bureaucracy. She sent emails to the Melbourne City Council and several other organizations, but her pleas for help were met with deafening silence. The only initial response came from two city councilors, Gladys Liu and Rafael Camilo, who visited the family in person. It was a kind gesture, a moment of human connection in a sea of indifference. But it did little to ease the family's growing desperation. They were the first ones to get back to us and visited us in person, which was nice. But in the end, we were back to square one, Ivana would later say. We still had to apply for assistance ourselves. The days that followed became a blur of pain, fear, and frustration. Juan was discharged from the hospital after 3 days, but her ordeal was far from over. She had become a prisoner in her own home, too terrified to go outside. The city she had once embraced had transformed into a place of fear and anxiety. She moved to a different area, hoping to escape the memories of what had happened. But the trauma followed her. She doesn't feel safe going out anymore. She's always vigilant, Ivana said. She can't tolerate having people behind her, and constantly looks around, anxious. Meanwhile, Ivana continued her fight for justice, a lonely battle against a system that seemed designed to exhaust and defeat her. She and her husband, both working full-time, could only chase updates after work. Their evenings were consumed by a frustrating quest for answers and accountability. She followed up on her initial emails on October 9th. Finally, on October 13th, she received a response from the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet. The response, however, was just another exercise in bureaucratic buck-passing. Her correspondence was shuffled between 3 different ministerial portfolios: the Minister for Police, the Minister for Health, and the Minister for Housing and Building. It was only when the CCTV footage of the attack was made public, when the story was exposed by 7 News on October 15th, that the wheels of government finally began to turn. Premier Jacinta Allen, who had been unaware of the incident until the footage emerged, publicly condemned the attack as a sickening act of violence. I send my support to the victim of this crime and their family, she wrote on social media. The accused offender is currently on remand awaiting court. For Ivana, the Premier's words were too little, too late. This case finally got the serious high-level attention it deserved long ago. But it's obvious that only happened after the news report, she said. On October 17th, the family finally heard from the Victorian Department of Justice and Community Safety, which offered immediate and longer-term support to Juan. But even then, the promise of help was shrouded in uncertainty. Ivana was told she would be contacted within 10 to 15 days, but she had no idea when financial support would actually arrive. I never expected the process to be this difficult and slow. It's not my sister's fault, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Victims who have already suffered physically and emotionally should not be forced to bear the additional burden of time, money, and complex bureaucracy on their own. The government's slow and passive compensation process amounts to a second trauma for law-abiding citizens. As the family struggled to navigate the system, details about the alleged attacker, Lauren Darrell, began to emerge. They painted a picture of a life that was as chaotic and troubled as Juan's had been ordered and disciplined. Darrell was homeless and had been living in a supportive housing project called Make Room, a joint venture between the Victorian government, Unison Housing, and various philanthropic and corporate partners. The project, located in the heart of the city, was designed to provide a safe and stable environment for people experiencing homelessness. But the safety that Make Room was supposed to provide was an illusion. Darrell was on bail at the time of the alleged attack and had been required to attend an appointment for her medication and mental health. She had failed to do so. She had also been reported missing by a state-run homeless shelter, which had notified the police and had been searching for her prior to the alleged attack on Juan. The fact that Darrell had been allowed to fall through the cracks of the system raised serious questions about the effectiveness of Make Room and the broader network of services for the homeless and mentally ill. Ivana, in her quest for answers, had also raised concerns about the tenant screening processes and the need for increased security at the housing project. The Victorian Housing Minister, Harriet Shing, responded to Ivana's concerns, assuring her that the department would work closely with the City of Melbourne, Unison Housing, Health Services, and Victoria Police to find ways to further improve the safety of all community members. But for Ivana and her family, these assurances were hollow. They were trapped in a bureaucratic loop of accountability where no department was willing to take responsibility for fixing the systemic failures that had led to the attack on Juan. The police referred them to MPs for any proposals about Make Room, but the MPs said it was not their responsibility. Lauren Darrell was arrested shortly after the attack and charged with 2 counts of intentionally causing injury and committing an indictable offense while on bail. The weapon used in the assault was also recovered. She appeared before the Melbourne Magistrates Court, where she dropped her bid for bail and was remanded in custody until her next appearance on November 25th. The police confirmed to the family that Darrell would not return to Make Room, but they also delivered a chilling piece of news. There was currently no legal mechanism to prevent her from being rehoused near Juan's new home in the future. The case of the sushi chef is a story of 2 women, 2 lives that collided in a moment of shocking violence. It is a story of a woman whose life was shattered by a random act of brutality, and of a sister who refused to let her be forgotten. It is also a story about a city, a society, and a system that failed to protect one of its most vulnerable citizens, and then failed to support the victim of that failure. It is a story that is still unfolding. A story that asks difficult questions about justice, compassion, and our collective responsibility to care for one another. And at its very core, this is a story about love that refuses to fade away. The unwavering love of a sister who simply would not be silenced. A love so powerful that it has transformed into a shining beacon of hope, cutting through even the deepest darkness. Story 8. The autumn of 2016 settled over Alpine, Texas like a gentle exhale. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, its rocky terrain and stubborn wildflowers still basking under a sun that had finally begun to soften its summer grip. Here in this remote pocket of West Texas, life moved to its own unhurried rhythm, shaped by the pulse of the local university and the breathtaking wilderness of the Big Bend region. For 22-year-old Zuzu Verk, a student at Sul Ross State University, Alpine had become a place where dreams took root. She'd traveled here from Keller, a quiet suburb in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, carrying with her a deep love for conservation biology and an eagerness to study the remarkable ecosystem that now surrounded her. Zuzu was the kind of person who lit up a room. Her future seemed as boundless as the Texas sky above, filled with promise and possibility. Friends knew her for that infectious brightness, that unwavering commitment to her studies. She juggled her coursework with a part-time job and had a crucial midterm exam waiting for her on Wednesday morning, October 12th. Her life was a carefully balanced dance of academics, work, and the complicated relationship she shared with Robert Fabian, her on and off boyfriend. Theirs was a stormy connection, marked by dramatic breakups and passionate reconciliations that kept Zuzu walking an emotional tightrope. On Tuesday evening, October 11th, Zuzu met up with friends, including Fabian, for a movie. It was the kind of carefree student night that offered a welcome break from looming exams. When the credits rolled, she and Fabian headed back to his apartment, a modest place in a small alpine complex. They had plans for dinner together. That was the last time anyone would see her. What happened in the hours that followed became a void that swallowed all the light from Zuzu's bright future, leaving behind only haunting questions. The first alarm bell rang the next day when Zuzu, always so dependable, simply didn't show up for her midterm. Then, she missed her work shift entirely. For everyone who knew her, this wasn't just unusual. It was impossible. Worry began to spread through her circle of friends like ripples on still water. Her phone rang endlessly, unanswered. Text messages disappeared into silence. By the next day, with still no word from Zuzu, that worry had transformed into something much darker. Zuzu Ferk was officially reported missing, immediately classified by authorities as endangered. Those first days after Zuzu vanished became a whirlwind of desperate activity and mounting terror. Her family, parents Lori and Glenn, and brother Miles, raced to Alpine as their world crumbled around them. The close-knit community, shaken to its core, wrapped them in support. Soon, Zuzu's radiant smile gazed out from flyers plastered across town, on streetlights, in storefront windows, covering every bulletin board on campus. The search began in earnest, driven by equal measures of hope and dread. Investigators from the Alpine Police Department started where any investigation must, with the last person known to have seen her alive, Robert Fabian. Right from the start, something about him didn't sit right. When they questioned him, his answers came out vague and disconnected, his whole demeanor strangely distant. Fabian admitted to police that he and Zuzu had argued that night, but insisted it was nothing more than words. He claimed she'd left his apartment in the early morning hours of October 12th, but his story felt paper-thin, and his lack of urgency was deeply unsettling. He wasn't behaving like someone whose girlfriend had vanished without a trace. When police examined Fabian's apartment, the last place Zuzu had definitely been, something felt wrong. The bed had been completely stripped, not a sheet or pillowcase anywhere to be found. It was a small detail, but it caught the investigators' attention like a snag. The whole scene felt staged, as if someone had carefully erased what had happened there. As they spoke with other residents of the apartment complex, an even more troubling picture began to take shape. Fabian's downstairs neighbor, John Franco, stepped forward with information that would prove crucial. He told police he'd heard loud disturbances coming from Fabian's apartment that night, sounds that suggested a violent argument. As days stretched into a full week, the investigation gained momentum, and the focus on Robert Fabian intensified. He suddenly stopped cooperating with law enforcement, a move that only fanned the flames of suspicion. Frustrated by his silence, authorities took the extraordinary step of officially naming him a suspect in Zuzu's disappearance. The search for Zuzu grew into something massive and heartbreaking. The Verk family maintained a constant presence in Alpine, their pleas for information echoing through the community as they refused to abandon hope. A reward fund swelled to $100,000 for any information that might bring her home. But every lead seemed to evaporate, and the harsh, endless landscape of Brewster County appeared to have claimed her completely. Detectives, now convinced that Fabian held the key to this mystery, began tracing his every move in the hours and days after Zuzu disappeared. What they discovered would crack the case wide open. On the evening of October 12th, after Zuzu had already been reported missing, Fabian had made a trip to a local variety store. He wasn't alone that day. His best friend, Chris Estrada, was right there with him. Security cameras captured both men moving through the store together. Using Estrada's credit card, Fabian bought several items, but it was the thin plastic painter's drop cloth that would later catch investigators' attention. It was such an odd purchase, one that seemed to make no sense at all. What made it even stranger was this. Investigators discovered that of the 3 drop cloths Fabian had bought, only one remained in his possession. The other 2 had simply vanished. Months crawled by. The initial burst of search activity slowed to an agonizing, grinding halt. For the Verk family, each day stretched into an unbearable limbo of waiting and wondering. Winter settled over West Texas, and Zuzu was still missing. The community's hope, once burning bright as a flame, had dimmed to barely a flicker. Everyone feared the same terrible truth. They weren't searching for a missing person anymore. They were looking for a body. That fear became reality on February 3rd, 2017. A U.S. Border Patrol agent was making his rounds through a remote area west of Alpine called Sunny Glen when something caught his eye. Something that didn't belong. There, partially hidden in a shallow grave off Wagon Road, were human skeletal remains. The location was miles from where Zuzu had vanished, a desolate, forgotten place where no one should have been. The Alpine Police Department rushed to the scene. Investigators swarmed the area, and there, scattered alongside the remains, they found something chilling. Tattered pieces of thin plastic sheeting. The kind that matched perfectly with those painters, drop cloths Fabian and Estrada had purchased months before. A few days later, dental records delivered the news everyone had been dreading. The remains were Zuzu Verk's. The confirmation hit the Verk family and the entire Alpine community like a crushing blow. 4 months of searching, 4 months of clinging to hope. All of it was over. Their daughter, their sister, their friend was gone forever. Her life cut tragically short. Her body abandoned in a shallow, unmarked grave. With Zuzu's body found, everything changed. This was no longer a missing person case. It was now a homicide investigation. All those pieces of evidence that had seemed circumstantial before suddenly formed a damning chain of proof. The timeline, the suspicious behavior, the stripped bed, the neighbor's testimony, and most damning of all, those plastic sheets. Everything pointed in one direction. Within 24 hours of identifying Zuzu's remains, police had what they needed. Robert Fabian was arrested and charged with tampering with evidence by concealing a human corpse. But that was just the beginning. Soon after, his charges were upgraded to first-degree murder. The investigation cast a wider net. Chris Estrada, the friend who had lent his credit card and his car for that suspicious shopping trip, was tracked down in Phoenix, Arizona. He, too, was arrested on charges of tampering with evidence. He waived extradition and returned to Texas to face the consequences. The wall of silence that had protected Robert Fabian was finally starting to crack. Facing serious legal trouble of his own, Chris Estrada made a choice. He decided to cooperate with prosecutors. He sat down with investigators and told them everything. The story that spilled out was horrifying. A second-hand confession of Zuzu's final moments, as told to him by the very man who had killed her. According to Estrada, Fabian had called him late that night, his voice filled with desperate panic. He said it was a matter of life or death. When they met, Fabian broke down and confessed everything. The dinner date with Zuzu had started well enough, Fabian told him. But then it had spiraled into another one of their explosive arguments. The fight escalated. It turned physical. There in the bedroom of his apartment, Fabian had wrapped his hands around Zuzu's neck and strangled her. He described to Estrada how she had struggled, hyperventilating, and then suddenly went still. In that terrible moment, Fabian realized what he had done. Panicked, he tried performing CPR, but it was far too late. Zuzu was gone. As the reality sank in, Fabian's mind shifted into what Estrada called survival mode. His thoughts were no longer about Zuzu. They were about himself. He didn't want to get caught, Estrada told police. What followed weren't the actions of a grief-stricken boyfriend who had made a terrible mistake. These were the calculated moves of someone trying to cover his tracks. He enlisted his friend's help, bought those plastic sheets, wrapped Zuzu's body, and drove out to the remote wilderness of Sunny Glen. There, he buried her, hoping she would never be found. Estrada revealed another troubling layer to this toxic relationship. He and Fabian had been involved sexually, a fact that had been a constant source of bitter conflict between Fabian and Zuzu. Robert Fabian's trial began in May 2019. Because of the extensive media coverage throughout West Texas, the court granted a change of venue, moving the proceedings to Caldwell County. Fabian entered a plea of not guilty, and his defense attorney argued that he was being wrongfully accused. They pointed to the absence of his DNA at the gravesite and insisted that any argument with Zuzu had been purely verbal. But the prosecution methodically built their case, piece by piece. They painted a portrait of Robert Fabian as a possessive, controlling partner. Frustrated by the turbulent state of his relationship with Zuzu, prosecutors laid out their evidence piece by piece. The plastic sheets told their own story, purchased by Fabian and Estrada, then discovered wrapped around Zuzu's body in that desolate desert grave. A coworker took the stand with unsettling testimony. After Zuzu vanished, Fabian's entire demeanor shifted. He became consumed by the investigation, relentlessly probing for details about what police had uncovered. It was a strange obsession for someone who claimed complete innocence. But the most devastating moment came on the trial's third day when Chris Estrada walked to the witness stand. As part of his plea agreement, pleading no contest to tampering with evidence, he agreed to testify against the man who had once been his closest friend. The courtroom fell silent as Estrada spoke. He described that haunting late-night phone call, recounting Fabian's chilling confession word by word. The jury listened as he revealed how Fabian had admitted to ending Zuzu's life in his own bedroom, and how his only thought afterward was escaping justice. 8 women and 4 men made up the jury. After deliberating for roughly 4 hours, they reached their unanimous verdict. Robert Fabian, guilty of murder, guilty of tampering with physical evidence. They dismissed the lesser charges of manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide, concluding that his actions had been both deliberate and calculated. The sentencing phase revealed the deep, lasting wounds Fabian's actions had carved into those left behind. Zuzu's brother, Miles Firk, rose from his seat and turned to face Chris Estrada directly. His victim impact statement cut straight to the heart of the accomplice's betrayal. "The right thing would have been calling the police instead of helping hide the evidence," Miles said, his voice heavy with grief. "If you had done that, my sister would have been found immediately." The jury needed only 3 hours to seal Robert Fabian's fate. Life in prison for Zuzu Firk's murder, plus an additional 20 years for tampering with evidence. Chris Estrada received 42 months behind bars for his role in concealing her body. The law had spoken. Justice, in legal terms, had been served. But for Zuzu Firk's family, no verdict could restore the bright-spirited young woman whose life had been so cruelly and senselessly cut short. A light forever extinguished in the vast, silent darkness of the West Texas desert. Story 9. The year was 1972, and in the sun-drenched heart of California's Central Valley, the town of Merced stood like a postcard of American life. Here, among the almond groves and peach orchards, life moved to the gentle rhythm of changing seasons and the honest work of farming. For the Stainer family, Delbert, Kay, and their 5 children, existence was beautifully simple, woven from the quiet threads of school, work, and family. Among the 5 siblings, something special existed between 2 brothers, Carrie and Stephen. Carrie, the older of the 2, was quiet and artistic, a watchful guardian who kept a protective eye on his younger, more spirited sibling. 7-year-old Stephen was pure joy in motion, his days painted with the carefree brushstrokes of school, friends, and all the simple pleasures that small-town childhood could offer. In the distance, Yosemite National Park cast its majestic shadow over their ordinary lives. Those granite peaks stood like silent sentinels, whispering promises of adventure. But on one bleak winter day, that very shadow would stretch into their world, bringing with it a darkness that would forever change the course of their family's story. December 4th, 1972 dawned cold and sleepy, the kind of day that made the warmth of home feel like a true sanctuary. Stephen Stainer, his small frame bundled tight against the chill, began his familiar journey home from school. His path carried him along Highway 140, a stretch of road he'd traveled countless times before. But on this particular day, his journey would be cut short by two men in a large white Buick. One was Kenneth Parnell, a convicted predator who worked at the Yosemite Lodge. The other was his simple-minded coworker, Irvin Edward Murphy, a man Parnell had cunningly manipulated into helping with his twisted plan. Murphy approached Stephen with a story about being a church representative, collecting donations and handing out religious materials. With an innocence that was heartbreaking in its purity, Stephen listened as the stranger asked whether his mother might be willing to donate to their cause. When Stephen said she would, Murphy asked where he lived. The white Buick pulled up alongside them. Stephen, trusting and unsuspecting, climbed inside, believing he was simply helping guide these men to his home. Instead, Parnell drove him miles away to a remote cabin in Cathy's Valley. As the car sped away from everything he knew and loved, Stephen's confusion slowly transformed into a dawning, childlike terror. At a payphone along the way, Parnell made a mock call. Returning to the car, he delivered a devastating lie to the 7-year-old. "I just spoke to your parents. They don't want you anymore." Later, he would weave an even more elaborate deception, telling Stephen that a court had granted him custody because his parents had too many children and simply couldn't afford to keep him. Back in Merced, as afternoon melted into evening, a knot of worry tightened in Kay Stainer's chest. Stephen was never late. Never. Panic set in, and the alarm was sounded. A massive search effort launched immediately, with the Merced Police Department leading the charge. The entire community rallied together, scouring fields and canals, their hopes dimming with each passing hour. But there was no sign of the little boy with bright eyes and an easy smile. He had simply vanished without a trace. For the Stainer family, the world had tilted completely off its axis. Their home, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with suffocating silence, a void that nothing could fill. For Carrie, losing his younger brother felt like losing a piece of his very soul. Neighbors would spot him making wishes on stars, a child's desperate plea to the heavens for his brother's safe return. The disappearance cast a long, dark shadow over Carrie's life, marking him forever as the kid whose brother was kidnapped. The once inseparable brothers were now worlds apart, one lost to an unknown fate, the other left behind to navigate a world that had suddenly become terrifying and uncertain. For 7 long years, Stephen Stainer ceased to exist. In his place lived a boy named Dennis Parnell, the supposed son of a drifter named Kenneth Parnell. This new identity became his cage, a psychological prison built on lies and manipulation. Parnell was a master manipulator who wore different masks, playing the role of father figure by day while becoming something far more sinister by night. He enrolled Dennis in various schools across California as they drifted from town to town, from Santa Rosa to Ukiah. To the outside world, they appeared to be nothing more than a father and son. But behind closed doors, Stephen was living through an unimaginable nightmare. Parnell controlled him not with chains or locks, but with something far more powerful: psychological manipulation. He convinced the young boy that he'd been abandoned, that he had nowhere else to turn. In a twisted display of control, Parnell allowed Stephen surprising freedoms, letting him drink, come and go as he pleased. Tactics designed to blur the lines between captivity and a warped version of normalcy. Stephen would later reveal that he could have escaped many times, but he was just a child who didn't know how to ask for help. A prisoner who didn't even realize the doors to his cell were unlocked. Despite the horror surrounding him, a flicker of the boy he once was somehow remained. Against all odds, he managed to thrive in school. He had a girlfriend, Lori Duke, who knew him only as Dennis. She remembered him as Spunky, a boy with an incredible personality who just wanted to fit in and be normal. But beneath the surface of this carefully crafted life, trauma simmered like a hidden fire. He was living a double life. A boy who was both a victim and, in the eyes of everyone around him, just another ordinary kid. While Stephen was navigating this surreal existence, his brother Kerry was wrestling with his own demons. Back in Merced, the crushing weight of his brother's absence had transformed him completely. He became a loner, a deeply unsettling loner, according to some, who showed no interest in girls or social connection. He was a gifted artist, even voted most creative at his high school, but he was also profoundly troubled. He developed a compulsion to pull out his own hair, a physical sign of the emotional storm raging inside him, and started wearing hats to hide the bald patches. The contrast between the two brothers was stark and heartbreaking. One, a victim of unthinkable abuse, who appeared to be a happy-go-lucky teenager. The other, safe at home, but lost in a wilderness of his own emotional pain. As Stephen entered puberty, reaching 14, Parnell's interest in him began to fade. He was growing up, becoming harder to control. Parnell wanted a new child, a younger boy he could shape and manipulate. He had even tried to use Stephen to lure other children, but Stephen, in quiet acts of defiance, had deliberately sabotaged these attempts. On February 14, 1980, Parnell took matters into his own hands. With the help of one of Stephen's teenage friends, he kidnapped 5-year-old Timothy White in Ukiah, California. Parnell brought the terrified little boy back to the home he shared with Stephen. For 2 weeks, Stephen watched as Timmy endured the same nightmare he had lived through 7 years earlier. The confusion, the fear, the heartbreaking separation from family. Something inside Stephen, a long-dormant protective instinct, suddenly awakened. He saw himself in the little boy's tear-filled eyes, and he knew he couldn't let history repeat itself. "I was not going to let that child go through what I had already been through," he later told his girlfriend. "And if I didn't take care of it now, it would just get worse." On March 1st, 1980, with courage that defied his years of captivity, Stephen made a decision that would change the course of 3 lives. He waited until Parnell left for his night security job. Then, taking Timmy by the hand, he walked out the door and never looked back. They hitchhiked through the night, their destination the town of Ukiah. It was dark, and Timmy, small and disoriented, couldn't remember where he lived. In that moment of uncertainty, Stephen made a pivotal choice. He decided to take the little boy to the one place he knew they could find help, the police station. He walked into that station, a lanky teenager with a small, frightened boy in tow, and spoke the words that would become famous. The simple, powerful sentence that reclaimed his identity. "I know my first name is Stephen," he told the officers. He explained what had happened, not only to Timmy, but to himself. The officers, initially bewildered, began sifting through old missing person reports. And there it was, a report for a 7-year-old boy named Stephen Stainer, who had vanished from Merced more than 7 years ago. The miracle that the Stainer family had prayed for, the hope they had clung to for 2,643 agonizing days, had finally come true. The news of Stephen's return was a seismic event, a story that captured the heart of a nation. He was hailed as a hero, a brave teenager who had rescued a little boy and escaped a monster. He returned to Merced to a whirlwind of media attention. A prodigal son returned from the dead. His parents, Delbert and Kay were overcome with joy so profound it was almost too much to bear. This is truly remarkable for a child to be missing for 7 years and to be found alive, Kay told the crowd of reporters gathered outside their home. They had kept every Christmas and birthday gift intended for him, a shrine of hope in a house filled with grief. But the joyous reunion was layered with complex and painful reality. The 7-year-old boy who had left them was gone. In his place stood a 14-year-old stranger who had been raised by his abuser. He recognized his parents, who he said had barely changed, but his siblings were unrecognizable. Carrie, the older brother who had once been his best friend, was now a stranger in both looks and personality. The brothers, who had been separated by tragedy, were now separated by a chasm of experience that seemed impossible to bridge. They shared a room, but they were worlds apart. Stephen, who had been allowed to smoke and drink and live without rules, struggled to adjust to the structure of family life. For 7 years, I had been supposedly an only child, he said in an interview. Now, I had to compete with a brother and 3 sisters. The hero's welcome soon faded, replaced by the harsh realities of readjustment. At school, he faced relentless bullying. Other students questioned his sexuality because of what he had endured. His relationship with his family, especially his father, grew increasingly strained. The boy who had survived a monster now found himself fighting an entirely new battle, a war against the ghosts of his past and the confusion of his present. The legal system offered little comfort. Stephen had to face Parnell in court, a deeply traumatizing experience for a teenager still reeling from his ordeal. In a move that sparked public outrage, Parnell was convicted of kidnapping, but sentenced to only 7 years in prison. He served just 5, less time than he had held Stephen captive. The lenient sentence felt like a slap in the face to Stephen and his family, a stark reminder of a justice system that had failed to grasp the depth of his suffering. The case did, however, prompt California to change its laws, allowing for longer consecutive sentences in abduction cases. After the trial, Stephen tried to rebuild his life from the shattered pieces of his past. He worked with child abduction groups, using his story to educate others. He fell in love, marrying Jody Edmondson, and having 2 children of his own, a daughter, Ashley, and a son, Stephen Jr. He found a semblance of normalcy, a life that was truly his own, free from the shadow of Kenneth Parnell. But the scars remained. On September 16, 1989, tragedy struck the Stainer family again. Stephen, now 24, was killed in a hit-and-run motorcycle accident on his way home from work. The hero who had survived 7 years of hell was gone, his life cut short in a senseless, random act of violence. At his funeral, 14-year-old Timothy White, the boy he had saved, served as a pallbearer. It was a poignant and heartbreaking tribute to the young man who had given him back his life. Stephen's death sent his older brother, Carrie, spiraling further into darkness. Shortly after, an uncle with whom Carrie was very close was shot and killed. Carrie suffered a series of nervous breakdowns, one of them violent. He fantasized about harming his boss and burning down his workplace. Instead of seeking help, he retreated to the place that had always been his refuge, Yosemite. In 1997, he got a job as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge, just outside the park's gates. For 2 years, he worked in the shadow of those majestic peaks, a quiet, unassuming presence. But beneath the surface, a monster was stirring. In February 1999, he talked his way into the motel room of Carol Sund, her daughter Julie, and Julie's friend Silvina Palazzo. He took the lives of all 3. 5 months later, he killed again. This time, a 26-year-old naturalist named Joar Armstrong. When he was finally caught, he confessed to all 4 murders. His motive was a chilling echo of his family's tragic past. He told a reporter he wanted a movie of the week made about him. Just like his famous brother, he had lived his life in the shadow of a hero. And in his twisted mind, the only way to escape that shadow was to become a villain of equal or greater infamy. In 2002, Gary Stayner was sentenced to death and remains on death row. The story of the Stayner family is a brutal American tragedy, a tale of two brothers whose lives were forever shaped by a single act of evil. One became a reluctant hero, a symbol of hope and resilience, who found the strength to save himself and another. The other became consumed by a darkness that may have been born in the shadow of his brother's tragic fame. The disappearance of Stephen Stayner was not just the story of a kidnapping. It was the story of a family shattered, of lives derailed, and of the long, dark, and often unpredictable aftershocks of trauma. In the end, the boy who came home was lost again, and the brother who was left behind became something unthinkable, leaving a legacy of horror that time can never erase. Story 10. The autumn air on Clark Street held a particular stillness, the kind that settles over forgotten places. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement with stubborn determination, while houses that were once homes now stood like hollow-eyed sentinels of neglect. On October 8th, 2025, that quiet was about to be shattered forever. A call came into the New Britain Police Department. The voice on the other end was hesitant, yet firm. The caller spoke of something strange, something that just didn't sit right. A man, a vehicle, and a large, heavy-looking plastic tote. The man had first been spotted near a cemetery, a place of quiet remembrance, before driving to the abandoned property on Clark Street. There, he wrestled the tote from his vehicle and left it behind, a final, graceless offering to the decay that had already claimed the house. Police arrived without fanfare, their presence a quiet intrusion into the silent street. They found the tote exactly where the caller said it would be. Sealed tight, its contents remained a mystery that hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken dread. The officers who opened it would carry that image with them for the rest of their days. Inside, in an advanced state of decomposition, were the remains of a child. It was the tragic end to a story that had played out in silence, a life that had been systematically and cruelly erased long before this discovery in the plastic bin. This was the final resting place, if one could call it that, of Jacqueline Torres Garcia, a 12-year-old girl her family called Mimi. She had been the victim of what authorities would later describe as prolonged physical abuse and malnourishment. Her death wasn't a sudden act of violence, but a slow, calculated descent into darkness, orchestrated by the very people who should have been her protectors. Her story isn't just one of unimaginable cruelty, but of a system that looked yet did not see, and a community that heard nothing because no one screamed. Jacqueline's life began in the shadow of institutional walls. She was born in January 2013, at a time when her mother, Carla Garcia, was in a detention center. In those first crucial moments of life, the bond between mother and child was severed by circumstance and steel doors. The Department of Children and Families, DCF, the state's designated guardian of vulnerable children, stepped in. The infant Mimi wasn't placed in the anonymous care of the foster system, but with family. She was given to her paternal grandmother, Patricia Delgado, a woman who would provide the only real stability Mimi would ever know. For 9 years, Mimi's world was the one her grandmother built for her. It was a world of routine, of school, of the simple comforts of a home where she was wanted. Patricia Delgado became her anchor in a life that had begun with uncertainty. In later interviews, the grandmother's grief would be a powerful force, her words choked with the sorrow of a future stolen. "Only God is helping me," she would say, her voice breaking. "God is helping me to pass this process. I've been with her forever, and I'm always going to be here now." In those 9 years, Mimi was a child like any other. She was enrolled in school. She had medical appointments. She was visible to the community. She was safe. But the threads of her past were never fully severed. Her parents, Carla Garcia and her father, remained on the edges of her life. In May of 2022, they decided they wanted their daughter back. They petitioned the court for guardianship, and a legal process began that would ultimately seal Mimi's fate. DCF, the same agency that had placed Mimi with her grandmother, now supported the reunification. The decision wasn't made lightly. According to the agency's later statements, they conducted a review of the family's history, assessed the parents' current ability to provide care, and even interviewed Mimi and her sibling. The prior relative guardian, her grandmother, and the child's own attorney also supported the move. On paper, it was a family being made whole again, a success story for an agency that increasingly prioritized family reunification over removal. In May 2022, a Superior Court judge granted the parents' request. 9-year-old Mimi left the only home she had ever known and went to live with her mother. The transition wasn't seamless. Mimi was now part of a new family unit, one that included not only her mother, Carla, but also Carla's boyfriend, Jonathan Nita, and her younger siblings. The family lived in Farmington, a town away from the familiar streets of New Britain. The life Mimi had known with her grandmother was replaced by a new, uncertain reality. The system that had reunified the family continued to watch, at least for a time. In September 2022, just a few months after Mimi had moved in with her mother, DCF opened another investigation. This one concerned her younger siblings. Caseworkers visited the home. They observed the children. They spoke with medical providers who expressed no concerns. Mimi and her siblings settled into school life, and from the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. They seemed to be fitting right into their new community. By November 2022, DCF wrapped up their investigation. There simply wasn't enough evidence to prove any abuse or neglect had taken place. Once again, the family got a clean bill of health. For the next 2 years, the official records tell us almost nothing. The family was left to their own devices, completely outside DCF's watchful eye. During this quiet period, Mimi made it to just 3 medical appointments. The last one was in May 2024. It would be the final time any professional outside her family would ever see her alive. Just 1 month later, in June 2024, everything shifted within the family in a way that would strip away the last bit of outside protection. Carla Garcia walked into family court and walked out with sole custody of Mimi and one of her siblings. DCF later made it clear they had no part in this decision. Now Carla held all the power. It was right around this time that the abuse began spiraling out of control. The reasons were as petty as they were heartless. Mimi was acting bad. Her mother would later confess that Mimi tried to run away twice, desperate attempts to escape what her home was becoming. Both times, family members found her and dragged her back. But she wasn't brought home to comfort. She was brought back to face punishment. The punishments were calculated and stripped away her humanity. They bound her small wrists with zip ties. They forced her into a corner of her bedroom, making her lie on absorbent pads like she was nothing more than an animal. The house in Farmington had stopped being a home. It had become a place of pure terror. And for Mimi, there was nowhere to run. The abuse didn't happen behind completely closed doors. Others witnessed it. Others knew what was happening. Carla's sister, Jacqueline Garcia, visited the Farmington house regularly. She saw her niece trapped in that corner. She watched as Mimi's body wasted away from starvation. She saw her bound with those zip ties. But instead of stepping in, instead of making the phone call that could have saved Mimi's life, Jacqueline became something far worse. A silent witness who sometimes participated. In a moment that chills the blood, she actually took a photograph of Mimi lying helpless on the floor, restrained on those pads, and sent it to her sister Carla. This wasn't a desperate cry for help. It was some kind of twisted communication between the two sisters. a record of suffering they both knew was happening. Jacqueline would later tell investigators something that haunts the soul. She knew Mimi was going to die as early as August 2024. She saw death approaching and chose to do nothing to stop it. Mimi's final weeks became a slow, agonizing fade into darkness. For roughly 2 weeks before her death, Carla and her boyfriend Jonathan Nita made the cruelest decision of all. They stopped feeding her completely. It was their ultimate punishment, their final act of control. This girl who had once sat in classrooms, who had family members who cared about her, was now utterly alone, slowly starving to death in the corner of her room. On September 19th, 2024, Jacqueline Mimi Torres Garcia de Dore. There was no single moment of violence to mark her passing, no fresh injuries for doctors to discover later. There was only the quiet, devastating result of weeks of starvation and cruelty. She was just 12 years old. The silence that filled the house after her death wasn't the silence of grief. It was the silence of people facing a grim, practical problem. What do you do with a body? Jonathan Nita took control of the situation. He carried Mimi's small, lifeless form down to the basement of the Farmington home and left her there. But a crime this enormous can't stay hidden forever. As days stretched into weeks, the smell of decay began creeping through the house, a constant, sickening reminder of what lay beneath their feet. The odor grew so overpowering that the family couldn't bear to stay there anymore. They started crashing with friends and checking into hotels, running from the physical evidence of their own cruelty. Months crawled by. Winter settled in. Mimi was dead and hidden, but her name still existed in official records, a loose thread in the fabric of government paperwork. In January 2025, someone pulled that thread. DCF received another complaint, this time about the welfare of Mimi's younger sibling. The caseworker got assigned to the case. They needed to check on all the children, including Jacqueline. When the caseworker reached out to Carla Garcia, she had her story ready. Mimi was being homeschooled now, she explained smoothly. This detail was crucial. It explained why she wasn't showing up in the public school system, where someone might notice a missing child. Carla added that Mimi was temporarily staying with a relative in another state. To meet the agency's requirement for actually seeing the child, they set up a video call. What happened next was a moment of breathtaking deception. Carla brought a child onto the video call and introduced her as Jacqueline. We still don't know who this child really was. Maybe a sibling or another young relative who'd been coached on what to say. For the DCF caseworker staring at their screen, the child who appeared was officially Mimi. The agency, apparently convinced they'd done their job properly, closed their investigation in March 2025. Mimi had been dead for 6 months. A ghost in the machine had vouched for her existence, and the system designed to protect her simply moved on. As the months slipped by, Carl Garcia seemed to drift through a world completely stripped of guilt or consequence. In a twist so bizarre, it reveals a mind utterly detached from reality. She began typing notes on her phone. She was planning to appear on a podcast. She was carefully crafting a narrative, a story she would share with the world about what had happened to her daughter. We'll never know what version of events she intended to tell. Would she paint herself as a victim? A grieving mother? Something else entirely? But the very act of preparing a public relations strategy for an undiscovered murder exposes a mindset so chilling, so completely divorced from the horrific reality of her actions. It defies comprehension. Eventually, the family packed up and left the house in Farmington, escaping the source of that persistent stench. But they couldn't leave the body behind. Nanita retrieved Mimi's remains from the basement, placing her inside a plastic storage tote, a final, undignified container for a life so cruelly stolen. For months, he carried that tote with them wherever they went. Then, on that October day in 2025, more than a year after Mimi had died, he drove to a quiet, abandoned street in New Britain. Perhaps he noticed the cemetery nearby and thought it fitting to dispose of his secret in the woods bordering consecrated ground. But something made him change his mind. Instead, he chose the anonymous decay of an empty house on Clark Street. There, he left the toad like a piece of discarded refuse. He probably believed it would be lost to time, swallowed by weeds and forgotten. Just like the girl inside. He was wrong. Someone was watching. That anonymous tip about suspicious activity on Clark Street became the single act of civic duty that unraveled everything. The discovery of Mimi's body sent shockwaves through New Britain and beyond. The investigation moved swiftly, with focus quickly falling on Mimi's family. Carla Garcia and her sister Jacqueline were arrested on Sunday, October 12, 2025. Jonathan Anita, the man seen moving the tote, was captured the following Monday night. The charges were severe. Carla Garcia, 29, and Jonathan Nanita, 30, faced murder with special circumstances and conspiracy. Bail for Carla was set at $5 million. Jacqueline Garcia, 28, was charged with unlawful restraint, risk of injury to a minor, and intentional cruelty to a person under 19 years old. Her bail was set at $1 million NAR. At the press conference, New Britain Mayor Aaron Stewart's voice trembled with emotion. As a mother, she said, "This makes me sick to my stomach to be standing here today." The case exposed a series of devastating failures. Public anger turned toward the Department of Children and Families. How could a child with a known history with the agency, a child who had been reunified with her family under their supervision, suffer and die in such a terrible way? DCF issued a statement promising a thorough review of our history with the family, acknowledging the need to examine their casework decisions, policy adherence, and collaboration with other agencies. Lawmakers demanded accountability and transparency. Republican senators issued a statement demanding full details of the video call that had allowed Carla to deceive the agency so easily. This is an example of why essential state employees' remote work must be constantly reviewed, especially when it involves protecting our most vulnerable residents, they stated. The case also reignited a heated debate over homeschooling regulation in Connecticut. Law. The fact that Carla had used homeschooling as cover to hide her daughter's absence wasn't lost on child advocates, who had long warned that the state's lack of oversight could conceal abuse. A push for what some called Mimi's Law began, calling for greater oversight of homeschooled children to ensure their well-being. The story of Jacqueline Mimi Torres Garcia is one of almost unimaginable darkness. It's the story of a mother who became her child's tormentor, an aunt who became a silent witness, and a partner who became an accomplice. But it's also the story of a system that failed at every turn, a reunification that led to death, closed cases that should have stayed open, a video call that became a fatal deception. Mimi's life wasn't lost in a single moment. It was chipped away day by day in a house where no one was truly watching. She was a ghost long before she died, invisible to the school system, invisible to the Child Protection Agency, a girl who vanished in plain sight. Her final lonely year was spent in the hands of those who should have loved her most. Her death became a secret they kept for over a year. The discovery in that plastic bin wasn't the beginning of the horror. It was simply its long overdue revelation. It was the moment the world was finally forced to see the girl everyone had missed. Story 11. In the crisp winter of 2009, the vast Texas panhandle stretched endlessly beneath a sky heavy with the promise of snow. Amarillo, a city of wide streets and weathered faces, pulsed with the quiet rhythm of everyday life. Ranchers tended their herds. Oil workers clocked in for long shifts. Families gathered around dinner tables, sharing stories of the day. But beneath this peaceful surface, shadows waited for the right moment to emerge. Sherry Mandrigan, a 55-year-old woman whose life bore the marks of resilience and quiet struggles, was about to step into those shadows. She would become a victim whose disappearance would unravel into a haunting tale of mystery, grief, and an enduring quest for justice, one that remains unsolved even 16 years later. Sherry was born in the heart of New Mexico, in the dusty town of Clovis, where the air carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant rumble of freight trains. Her family, rooted deep in Southwest traditions, spoke a blend of English and Spanish. Their days were filled with farm work and the warmth of close-knit gatherings. Sherry was the kind of woman who wore her strength like an old denim jacket, faded but enduring. She'd faced hardships early, navigating a childhood where resources were scarce and responsibilities came young. By her 20s, she'd moved to Amarillo, drawn by the promise of better opportunities in this bustling cattle and energy hub. There, she found work wherever she could, waitressing at local diners, taking clerical positions in small businesses, always with that steady determination to support herself and those she loved. Life in Amarillo suited Sherry in its simplicity. She lived in a modest apartment on the city's north side, surrounded by neighbors who knew her as friendly and reliable. Sherry had a son, though she kept details of his life close, a testament to her protective nature. She wasn't one for grand gestures or seeking the spotlight. Instead, she built her world through small acts of kindness, sharing meals with friends, checking in on elderly relatives, maintaining a garden of resilient wildflowers that bloomed defiantly against the harsh winds. Her appearance was unpretentious. Dark hair often pulled back in a practical ponytail, warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, hands calloused from years of honest work. Friends described her as someone who listened more than she spoke, offering quiet wisdom drawn from her own battles with loss and change. January 25th, 2009, dawned cold and clear, the kind of day when wind bit through coats and hurried people indoors. Sherry had plans that morning, mundane yet vital. Perhaps a doctor's appointment or a trip to the grocery store for supplies. She was last seen alive near her home in the 1300 block of North Spring Street, a residential area dotted with single-family homes and vacant lots where tumbleweeds gathered like forgotten thoughts. Witnesses later recalled seeing her that afternoon, walking with purpose along the sidewalk, her coat bundled tight against the chill. But as the hours ticked by into evening, Sherry didn't return. Her absence was noticed first by a close friend who'd expected her for a casual visit. Calls went unanswered, her phone ringing into the void. By the next day, worry had taken hold. Sherry's family, siblings, nieces, and nephews, scattered across Texas and New Mexico, began reaching out. Her, living out of state, was alerted and grew increasingly anxious. The Amarillo Police Department received the missing person report on January 26th, a routine filing that would unleash a storm of questions with no answers. Detectives started with the basics, canvassing the neighborhood, checking her last known locations, reviewing financial activity. Sherry's bank account remained untouched. Her car sat parked neatly in the driveway, keys still hanging on a hook inside. There were no signs of sudden departure, no packed bags, no notes, no travel plans. It was as if she had simply vanished into the thin air of the Panhandle. The investigation unfolded slowly at first, like a river carving through reluctant stone. Officers interviewed neighbors who spoke of Sherry's routine life. One elderly woman recalled seeing her earlier that day, waving hello as Sherry passed by with a grocery bag in hand. Another neighbor mentioned occasional visitors to her home, but nothing out of the ordinary. Perhaps a handyman or friend dropping by. Sherry's workplace confirmed she hadn't shown up for her shift. Her employer expressed concern, noting her impeccable attendance record. Detectives delved into her personal connections, speaking with family members who painted a picture of a woman who, despite her independence, relied on a tight circle for support. There were no known enemies, no bitter disputes, no hints of danger lurking in her daily path. Yet as days turned to weeks, the leads dried up. Searches of local parks, hospitals, and bus stations yielded nothing. Sherry's face stared back from missing person flyers that covered every utility pole and store window in sight. Her radiant smile had become a haunting reminder of a life suddenly cut short. With each passing day, her family's anguish deepened. Sherry's sister, Maria, stepped into the role of unofficial spokesperson. Her voice remained steady during media interviews, though desperation coursed beneath the surface. "Sherry wouldn't just leave us like this," Maria insisted in one early report, her eyes red-rimmed from countless sleepless nights. The siblings gathered at their childhood home in Clovis, carefully sifting through memories and photographs. They clung to hope that Sherry might walk through the door with some reasonable explanation. The holidays loomed ahead like storm clouds. Valentine's Day approached, then her birthday in March. Each milestone only made the emptiness more unbearable. They organized community searches, with volunteers combing the vast open lands around Amarillo, those desolate places where bodies sometimes surfaced in arroyos or forgotten fields. But spring arrived and departed without a single trace. The wild grasses turned green while the family's hopes slowly withered away. Then came April 13th, 2009. 3 months after her disappearance, the unthinkable became reality. A real estate agent was preparing a vacant house in the 1300 block of North Spring for a showing. She made her way to the detached garage behind the property. The house had sat empty for months, its windows boarded up against squatters and harsh weather. As she pushed open the creaky door, a sharp, unmistakable odor hit her like a wall. There, in the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls, lay a body wrapped tightly in a rug. Decomposition had advanced, but the form was still recognizably human. The agent stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. With trembling hands, she called 911. Police arrived within minutes, quickly cordoning off the scene as forensics teams moved in. The discovery sent shockwaves through Amarillo. Word spread like wildfire, and Sherry's family received the devastating news as gently as possible. Detectives arriving at their homes with the confirmation they dreaded. The autopsy conducted over the following days revealed the grim truth. Sherry had been shot once in the upper body. The bullet entered her back, suggesting she was either unaware of the danger or trying to flee. The wound proved fatal, causing rapid blood loss. She had been dead since shortly after her disappearance. Her body had been hidden in that garage just blocks from where she was last seen. The rug, an ordinary household item now stained with her blood, showed a desperate attempt to conceal the crime. No murder weapon was found at the scene, and the garage bore signs of hasty disposal. The dirt had been disturbed, but no fingerprints or DNA were immediately evident. The ruling came swiftly: homicide. Amarillo police elevated the case to their major crimes unit, assigning a lead detective whose experience with panhandle violence, often tied to domestic disputes or drug-related feuds, guided this renewed effort. The body's proximity to Sherry's home suggested the killer was local, someone familiar with the area who could move quickly to hide the evidence. Investigators re-interviewed associates, focusing on any recent conflicts. Sherry had no criminal record, but detectives probed her social circle for hidden tensions. Was there a jilted lover? A financial dispute? A random act gone terribly wrong? The family cooperated fully, providing access to her belongings and sharing stories from her final weeks. Maria recalled Sherry mentioning vague worries about someone bothering her, but nothing concrete enough to pursue. Her son flew in, his face etched with grief, vowing to do whatever it took to find answers. As spring warmed into summer, the investigation intensified. Divers searched nearby stock ponds and canals, hoping to find the weapon or additional evidence. The FBI was consulted for profiling, describing the perpetrator as likely a male acquaintance. Impulsive, yet calculated enough to cover his tracks. Media coverage surged. Local outlets like AB7 Amarillo ran segments that humanized Sherry, showing her photo and recounting her love for gardening and devotion to family. The public responded with tips, and anonymous calls flooded the hotline. One lead pointed to a suspicious vehicle seen near her home on January 25th, but it led nowhere. Another suggested a connection to transients in the area, but alibis cleared all suspects. Frustration mounted as the trail grew cold. The summer heat seemed to mirror the boiling tension in the police precinct. By fall 2009, the case had gone cold, filed away with dozens of others haunting the department. But Sherry's family refused to let it fade. They partnered with Amarillo Crime Stoppers, offering rewards that started at $1,000 and grew over time. In 2015, on the 6th anniversary, they increased it to $5,000, a sum scraped together from donations and personal savings. Maria held press conferences, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "Someone knows what happened to my sister. Please come forward for Sherry." The emotional toll was unmistakable. Holidays became memorials. Birthdays turned into shadows of what they once were. Sherry's son, now shouldering the weight alone, would visit the garage site, standing silently where her body had lain. The wind whispered through the empty house like unanswered questions, carrying secrets that someone, somewhere, still refused to tell. Years melted into one another, the Panhandle's endless season serving as a backdrop to the family's unwavering vigil. Detectives would return to the evidence from time to time, sending samples through the latest DNA technology. In 2022, the Amarillo Police Department officially launched their Cold Case Unit, a dedicated team ready to breathe new life into forgotten files. Sherry's case landed among the first to be reviewed, her file pulled from storage and examined with renewed focus. Fresh interviews were conducted, witnesses pressed to recall details that might have slipped away. The autopsy photos, the rug fibers, the ballistics report, all of it studied through new eyes. But breakthroughs remained just out of reach. Tips came in sporadically, yet none led anywhere meaningful. The killer, whoever they were, had vanished into time's vast anonymity. Then, in May 2025, 16 years after the murder, the Amarillo Police Department made a public appeal for information, sparking fresh media attention. A Facebook post from local news outlets displayed Sherry's photo next to the garage, with a simple plea. The Cold Case Unit is seeking tips on the 2009 murder of Sherry Mandrine. The response brought hope. Crime Stoppers calls picked up. Strangers shared theories online. But closure remained as distant as ever. The family, now grayer and worn down by years of waiting, carried on. Maria, speaking in a recent interview, captured the lasting pain of their loss. Every single day, I think about what Sherry could have been doing, the grandkids she might have spoiled, the stories she would have shared. It all that never fills. Nish. The impact of Sherry's murder rippled far beyond her immediate family, shaking the Amarillo community like a quiet earthquake. Neighbors who once waved to her began locking their doors a little tighter. The vacant garage was eventually torn down, but its memory lingered. Detectives carried the burden too. One officer, speaking anonymously, admitted that cases like this invaded their dreams, a constant reminder of how fragile justice can be. Sherry's story grew into something larger, becoming a symbol in cold case advocacy. Her name was mentioned in discussions of unsolved homicides throughout Texas. Groups like the Texas Rangers Cold Case Squad would reference it during training sessions, highlighting the importance of never giving up. As the sun sets over the Panhandle today, casting long shadows across North Spring Street, the question of who killed Sherry Mandrine still hangs heavy in the air. Was it a moment of sudden rage? A calculated act of betrayal? Or perhaps a stranger's cruelty? The evidence suggests someone familiar with that hidden garage, someone who knew the area well. But no face has emerged from the fog of uncertainty. The family holds on to faith, the belief that truth will eventually surface. In quiet moments, they choose to remember Sherry not as a victim, but as the woman who laughed with ease, who met life's challenges with unwavering grace. Her unsolved murder stands as a testament to loss that endures. It's a story that builds tension not through dramatic plot twists, but through the slow, aching weight of grief that refuses to fade. Story 12. The salt-laced wind of the Shetland Islands carries a voice all its own. It whispers ancient tales of weathered mariners and rugged landscapes, stories of lives lived in harmony with the raw, untamed beauty of the North Sea. On the small island of Burrow, this wind was a constant companion to Richard Horne, known to the world as Harry Horse. Harry was an artist, author, and musician, a man of immense talent and boundless creativity. His life was a vibrant tapestry, woven with threads of imagination and deep love for his wife, Mandy Duck. But the Shetland wind, in its eternal wisdom, also carries whispers of sorrow. In the winter of 2007, it would witness a tragedy so profound it would forever scar the island's memory. This is a story of love, desperation, and darkness lurking beneath the surface of what seemed an idyllic life. Harry and Mandy Horse were a couple who seemed to have stepped straight from a storybook. Harry, with his wild mane of hair and spirit as untamed as the Shetland ponies roaming the hills, was a celebrated creator of children's books and political cartoons. His art was whimsical and full of life, a true reflection of the man himself. Mandy, his muse and anchor, was a woman of quiet strength and gentle spirit. Their love was a masterpiece, a collaboration of two souls who had found their perfect rhythm in the remote tranquility of their island home. They lived in a world of their own making, filled with art, music, and the simple joys of life, lived far from modern chaos. Their home stood as a testament to their shared creativity, a haven of warmth and color against the stark beauty of the Shetland landscape. Here stories were born, melodies were composed, love blossomed in the quiet intimacy of their shared existence. But even in this haven, a shadow was beginning to lengthen, a darkness that would slowly, inexorably consume the light of their lives. Mandy had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a cruel and relentless disease slowly stealing her away from herself and from the man who loved her more than life itself. The early days of Mandy's illness brought challenges, but ones they faced together with courage and resilience that inspired all who knew them. Harry became her caregiver, his devotion unwavering as he tended to her every need. He bathed her, fed her, and read to her, his voice a soothing balm against the pain and frustration of her failing body. He was her rock, her constant, her everything. But as the disease progressed, so too did the toll it took on both of them. Mandy's world shrank to the confines of her bed, her vibrant spirit trapped in a body that had become her prison. And Harry, her devoted protector, began to crumble under the weight of his love and grief. The man who had once been the life of every gathering, whose laughter had echoed through their home's halls, grew increasingly withdrawn and isolated. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a sadness so profound it seemed to cast shadows on everything he touched. Friends and family watched with growing concern as he retreated further into himself, his creative spark flickering and fading. He spoke of the unbearable pain of watching the woman he adored suffer, of his helplessness in the face of her relentless decline. He was a man adrift on a sea of sorrow, with no land in sight. The Shetland winter of 2007 was particularly harsh. The island lay shrouded in a blanket of snow and perpetual twilight. The wind howled and raged, its mournful cry a fitting soundtrack to the tragedy about to unfold. On a cold January day, a friend of the couple, concerned after not hearing from them for several days, made their way to the house. The home was eerily silent, the only sound, the relentless moaning of the wind. A sense of dread hung heavy in the air, a premonition of the horror that lay within. The friends' worst fears were realized when they entered. The scene that greeted them was one of unimaginable tragedy. In the bedroom, lying side by side on their bed, were the bodies of Harry and Mandy Horse. At first glance, it appeared to be a scene of tragic but peaceful release, a final act of love and mercy. The initial reports painted a picture of a devoted husband who, unable to bear his wife's suffering any longer, had chosen to end both their lives in a final, desperate embrace. The world mourned the loss of a great talent and a great love, a story that seemed to speak to the depths of human devotion and the unbearable pain of loss. The media reported it as a tragic love story, a modern-day Romeo and Juliet who had chosen to leave the world together rather than be parted by illness. The narrative became one of a merciful husband freeing his beloved wife from her pain, a story that resonated with a public grappling with the complex issues of end-of-life care and mercy. This was a story that wrapped people in a strange kind of comfort, a way to make sense of something that made no sense at all. But as police dug deeper into their investigation, a far more disturbing picture began to emerge. A picture that would completely shatter the romanticized tale and reveal a truth that was both more brutal and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The coroner's report read like a document of cold, hard facts, a stark contrast to the gentle stories that had been making their way through the media. It revealed that Mandy Horse had not simply drifted away peacefully in her sleep. She had been stabbed as many as 30 times. The report also detailed defensive wounds scattered across her arms and hands, a silent testament to her final, desperate fight for life. The woman who had been painted as a willing partner in a suicide pact had actually fought with everything she had against the man she loved and trusted above all others. The image of a merciful husband crumbled, replaced by the horrifying reality of a killer. The investigation revealed just how ferocious the attack had been. The knife Harry had used actually broke during the assault, a chilling detail that spoke volumes about the violence of his actions. Undeterred, he had walked to the kitchen to find another weapon and finish what he'd started. The man who had once been her protector had become her executioner. After taking his wife's life in this frenzy of violence, Harry Horse then turned the knife on himself, inflicting 47 wounds before his own injuries claimed him. The scene was so disturbing that the attending doctor had to take time off work, saying it was the worst crime scene he'd ever witnessed. When the truth finally came to light, it sent shockwaves of horror and disbelief rippling through the Shetland community and far beyond. The story of a tragic love pact was exposed as a lie, a comforting fiction that had hidden a brutal and unforgiving reality. The man who had been celebrated as a romantic hero was now revealed as a murderer. The narrative had been torn apart, and in its place stood a story of domestic violence, of a man whose desperation had twisted into something monstrous. The question that haunted everyone was simple. Why? What had driven a man who so clearly loved his wife to commit such a terrible act? Was it simply the crushing weight of being a caregiver? A moment of madness born from grief and despair? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? A hidden side to Harry Horse that had been masked by his public face. In the months leading up to the tragedy, Harry's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. He had confided in friends about his despair, about feeling like he was losing himself in the endless cycle of caregiving. He had become a ghost in his own life, his identity completely consumed by his wife's illness. Some have wondered if he was suffering from severe depression, a mental illness that went untreated and ultimately consumed him. The man who had brought so much joy to the world through his art had been living in a private hell, a hell that ultimately drove him to an act of unimaginable violence. The case of Harry and Mandy Horse is a story with no easy answers, no simple explanations. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about love, loss, and the darkness that can live within the human heart. It challenges our romanticized ideas about love and sacrifice, reminding us that even the most devoted love can be twisted into something monstrous. The wind still blows across the Shetland Islands, its voice a constant reminder of both the beauty and sorrow of this remote corner of the world. It whispers the story of Harry and Mandy Horse, A story that isn't a romance, but a tragedy. It's a story of love, tested beyond its limits. Of a man who broke under the weight of his grief, and of a woman whose life was stolen by the one person who had sworn to protect her. It serves as a chilling reminder that the line between love and madness, between devotion and destruction, can be terrifyingly thin. And as the wind continues to blow, it carries with it all those unanswered questions, the lingering sorrow, and the permanent stain of a love story that didn't end with a gentle fade, but with a brutal and heartbreaking final chapter. Harry Horse's legacy is now split in two. A legacy of creative genius intertwined with a darkness that ultimately consumed him. A legacy forever connected to the wild, windswept beauty of the Shetland Islands, and the tragic story of the woman he loved and killed. The final terrible irony is this. In his desperate attempt to end his wife's suffering, he inflicted upon her the greatest suffering of all, and in doing so, he destroyed himself. The vibrant tapestry of their life together was reduced to a tangled mess of heartbreak and loss, a cautionary tale for the ages. The Shetland winds, in their endless dance across the islands, will carry the story through generations yet to come. A quiet, eternal tribute to a love that slipped away in the darkest of nights.